Ask yourself a simple question. Is the world around you real? It seems like the answer should be pretty obvious. Of course the world as you know it is real. How else would you be able to interact with it? Perhaps a better question would be this. How much do you trust that the world you know is real? How much do you believe that reality, as you experience it, is constant and cannot be changed by external forces? Now imagine, if you can, an entity to which the very fabric of reality is like clay, able to be shaped and molded at will. Then imagine that this entity, this malicious, twisted, and unknowable horror, has taken a special interest in you. If you can picture such a scenario, then you may as well be standing in the shoes of James Talleyrand, a Foundation researcher assigned to SCP-3999. Talleyrand could only have imagined what the Foundation kept contained in an airtight cell all the way at the bottom of a kilometer-long shaft, and never expected that this was where his lifeless body would be found. Despite having the entity contained, the Foundation's only knowledge of SCP-3999 came from a text document discovered on Talleyrand's phone after his demise. Even their own records indicated that no such creature ever existed. Why? What could possibly shape reality in such a way that it could hide its own existence from the Foundation? And where was it now? The document on Talleyrand's phone yielded some evidence, seeming to be a long, rambling, and confused account of some sort of battle between a reality-shaping entity and the ill-fated researcher sent to examine it. Unlike many of the Foundation's documents, the entry for SCP-3999 is riddled with contradictions and strike-throughs, a confusing mess of information that makes piecing together the mysteries of Talleyrand's fate all the more difficult. Beneath the strange formatting and uncertainty surrounding SCP-3999 lies the tale of one man's torture for the amusement of an impossibly powerful and eternally sadistic creature. Based on the information available, it appears that SCP-3999 was fixated on Talleyrand. Upon his arrival to the entity's cell, the researcher had no idea how long he would spend in the company of SCP-3999, or that he would never emerge alive. Many SCPs contained by the Foundation require their own specially made prisons in order to hold them and maintain the safety of Foundation staff as well as the outside world. But imagine if an SCP could turn the tables, bending the world around a single member of the Foundation, using all of reality as their own personalized torture chamber. The list of horrors endured by Talleyrand is both exhaustive and incomplete, given the length of time he spent with the creature. Shortly after James Talleyrand was assigned to Site-118, where SCP-3999 was contained, the entity was somehow able to breach containment and began to twist the world around it in the name of a singular, cruel objective: the torture of James Talleyrand. The creature, while having no physical description, possessed the capability to cause either a CK-class reality restructuring event or a ZK-class end-of-reality event. SCP-3999 was somehow able to both destroy reality itself while simultaneously rebuilding it around its prisoner, Researcher Talleyrand. Every creature, person, and machination that SCP-3999 created was done so with the express intention of making Talleyrand suffer horribly, over the course of millions of years, according to the researcher's own writings. The exact details of how SCP-3999 tortured Talleyrand are littered throughout the document he was found with, but it is apparent that the entity was able to use its reality-altering abilities to continually revive the man after killing him as a way to prolong his pain. SCP-3999 seemed to be able to use its powers however it pleased, but focused all its attention and actions on causing misery for one man. It simply enjoyed inflicting suffering. One of the examples of the atrocities James Talleyrand suffered at the mercy of a cold, remorseless creature was witnessing the deaths of others. Although they were constructed and controlled by SCP-3999, Talleyrand saw trained Foundation security personnel drag 3 people into the cell. He recognized them instantly as his own family. Talleyrand was made to watch as his mother, father, and sister were executed with a single gunshot to the head by members of the same organization that he was a part of. All of Talleyrand's professional colleagues were also killed in front of him, followed by anyone and everyone that had come into contact with James Talleyrand, including the O5 Council. He was made to watch as they were systematically murdered one by one, all for the enjoyment of SCP-3999. At some point during the creature's torture of Talaran, there appears to have been some attempt to contain SCP-3999 within another SCP, SCP-2432, a room within a hotel now owned by the Foundation that appears to compel its guests to write exaggerated positive reviews after staying there. When introduced to SCP-2432, SCP-3999's ability to alter reality seemed to have the effect of creating a dimensional anomaly within the hotel. A crawlspace opened up in SCP-2432, leading to an almost identical room. The front door of this new room, designated SCP-2432-1, led to an alternate dimension that resembled the hotel housing SCP-2432. The rooms of this new version of the SCP-2432 hotel were a seemingly infinite, endless loop of rooms. This dimension also played host to a number of strange creatures, as uncovered by Foundation research teams that ventured there. Most notably, a creature resembling a male Homo sapien, calling itself Researcher Talaran. This being was dressed in clothing similar to Foundation researchers and appeared nervous and confused when approached by personnel, only to be executed when asked to be told the location of SCP-3999. Later during SCP-3999's 3 million year torture session, James Talaran was interviewed with another doctor working for the Foundation. The interviewing doctor had no recollection of Talaran's assignment to SCP-3999, and both James's involvement with the Foundation and the very existence of SCP-3999 were expunged from the Foundation's database. As Talaran desperately tried to rationalize what was happening to him, he told the interviewer, "I have trouble focusing on things now. I just feel a lot of unease. It's like reality has started to feel less real, if that makes sense." Shortly after, he attempted to ask the doctor for his name and for him to identify which of the Foundation sites they were at. In response, the doctor emitted a strange noise from his mouth, confusing Talaran. "That's not a name. You just made a noise with your mouth," the researcher replied. "Why am I thinking of redactions? How can a word be redacted like that in a normal conversation?" Following this, the floor beneath James Talaran's feet disappeared, and he was swallowed by darkness, as SCP-3999 continued bending reality to make him suffer. What followed were multiple failed attempts from Talaran to either escape from the entity or nullify its abilities to warp reality. SCP-3999 had, at a later point, trapped Talaran in a stage play version of its cell. As James frantically tried to escape out of a nearby door, where he hoped to find reality, he was met with a solid wall. "I'm trapped in whatever this place is with this thing, and there's no outside reality anymore," he realized. Researcher Talaran tried to understand the entity, but SCP-3999 defied description. It was simply chaos. In his desperation, Talaran was able to dig a tiny hole in the floor through which he could see a light. Filled with thoughts of his beloved family, his colleagues, and the rest of the world that had once existed, he opened the hole wider. It is unclear what happened after this, but it is apparent that James Talaran was still unable to escape SCP-3999. However, as the situations he found himself in grew increasingly strange, James Talaran was able to take greater control of his predicament. This is evidenced in the Foundation's document regarding SCP-3999. Researcher Talaran cannot be contained by this. Researcher Talaran will fight his way back. Researcher Talaran will recontain SCP-3999. This torture had gone on long enough, and researcher James Talaran was determined to be free of the creature that had taken such sick pleasure in his pain. Talaran at one point was able to subdue SCP-3999, although it is initially unclear how he accomplished this. There were several attempts made to contain the entity, using a recursive joke, a melon, the graves of American crime novelist Robert B. Parker, or an O5 council member, and a roach motel. It is believed that every single one of these attempts failed. Attempting to beat the creature at its own game, Talaran tried to turn SCP-3999's reality-altering powers against it by imagining the entity as something easier to subdue. These included several moldy blankets, a murderous penguin, and a pillow. Eventually, Talaran was able to contain SCP-3999 with the aid of 48 trained containment personnel, all of whom were also Researcher Talaran. During this time, a conversation between the two were partially recorded, although any dialogue from SCP-3999 suffered from data corruption. Claiming to finally be in charge and in control of the situation, Talaran interrogated SCP-3999, berating the creature for keeping him prisoner. "You can't frighten me anymore. For the first million years of nonsensical containment procedures and tortures and dream logic, it was the worst pain I had ever felt, but I survived. For the second million years, it was still the hardest thing I had ever done, but I survived. By the third million years, I was growing numb." The researcher tried to ascertain the exact nature and origin of SCP-3999, but to no avail. Vowing to fight the entity, Talaran told it, "Here's the thing about horror and weirdness. The more you reveal of it, the less effect it has. I am sick of your horror. I am sick of you." Afterwards, he was melted into goo for 5 years. It appears that shortly after this, researcher Talaran managed to understand how to destroy SCP-3999. While the entity was immortal and virtually unstoppable, he realized its weakness, that it had to bond to another being in order to survive. Upon discovering this, Talaran took his own life, causing all that SCP-3999 had done to disappear. After Foundation researcher James Talaran committed suicide, reality reverted to its original state, before SCP-3999 had heavily altered it. His death freeing reality from the evil entity once and for all. The Foundation remains unaware of what SCP-3999 was or indeed is, and one can only guess as to why the entity subjugated Talaran to such terror and horror. What made this powerful reality bender hold such a perverse fixation on one man? Some have likened the creature to a horror writer, continually subjugating a character to all manner of nightmares before deciding to redraft and try something new. Whatever it was, SCP-3999 carries with it a warning that reality isn't always as it seems. The fabric of our world is littered with strange doorways if you know where to look for them. Tears, portals, anomalies, all leading to places and planes beyond human imagining and understanding. And SCP-2317, otherwise known as a door to another world, certainly fits that description. Contained and kept at all times under the watch of armed guards, SCP-2317 appears to be a simple and unsuspecting wooden door in its frame. It hardly looks like it requires such extreme round-the-clock security, or needs a strange, secretive ritual that the Foundation performs, presumably to keep the door closed. But of course, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed doorway isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. Even by the Foundation's already high standards, the requirements and regulations for personnel who are assigned to SCP-2317 seem oddly specific. Psychological testing is standard practice to work for the Foundation, but an additional hurdle that anyone has to clear before even getting to glimpse at this unassuming wooden door is having a score of at least 72 on the Milgram Obedience Examination. It is also mandatory that personnel assigned to maintaining it are both unmarried, with no children or next of kin, as well as an unwavering, unquestioning loyalty to the Foundation, pure devotion to its code and objectives. These may seem like strange requirements. After all, SCP-2317 is just a door, isn't it? Perhaps there's a reason that the Foundation keeps so much of the information about SCP-2317 buried deep under layers upon layers of security, with only the Overseer Council privy to the full details of its strange nature. Knowledge, as they say, is power, but maybe knowing too much about whatever is behind that door can prove deadly. Still, if SCP-2317 is a door to another world, an alternate dimension, or parallel reality, it must be safe enough to visit. After all, the Foundation has been sending personnel in there on a regular basis. Daily, in fact. According to the O5 Council, this is done as part of a procedure to maintain active containment of something lurking beyond that old wooden doorframe. But what could possibly warrant such constant maintenance and surveillance? In accordance with the Foundation's guidelines, all staff are required to rotate out of observing SCP-2317 after every 2 months, and spend the following third month in full psychological counseling, before they are permitted to return to the containment unit housing the door to another world. It was after one of these month-long periods of evaluation that a Foundation guard was informed that his security clearance has been raised to level 3, and that he'd been selected for the duty of carrying out 220 Calabasas. He knew the name instantly. This was the title given to the daily containment procedure that absolutely had to be carried out. The guard didn't question these orders. After all, he'd been selected precisely because of his loyalty to the Foundation. He did make one request to his commanding officer, however. He wanted to know what had happened to the last guard that had performed the procedure. "Didn't make it out of psychological evaluation," the officer replied. Not letting this affect his dedication, the guard was told to prepare for procedure 220 Calabasas, along with a fellow member of Foundation security personnel. The guard was instructed to gather everything on a strange list. The first was a pre-selected member of Class D personnel, specifically a convicted murderer. Class D refers to disposable class personnel, expendable individuals recruited by the Foundation for the sole purpose of testing SCPs. Class Ds were usually prison inmates repurposed for SCP testing, and the one chosen for 220 Calabasas was no exception, serving multiple life sentences for murders, or at least that's what the guard had been told. A Foundation personnel member instructed him to refer to the Class Ds solely as the assistant from that point on. Next, the guard collected a live chicken, an obsidian-edged knife, a silver aspergillum and aspersorium, to be filled with 500 cc's of holy water that had been blessed by a priest of the Abrahamic faith, and finally, a 1 kiloton nuclear device, which according to instructions was only to be detonated in the unlikely event of a catastrophic containment failure. In other words, the last resort. After following his instructions to the letter and without question, the guard and his colleague were briefed. The Foundation personnel member informed them that he'd be joining and leading them in the procedure. The staff member also specified that henceforth he'd be referred to as the Celebrant until the completion of 220 Calabasas. The guard was acutely aware of how specific these instructions were, but trusted in the Foundation, knowing that if they wanted this procedure performed a certain way, then it was in everyone's best interest to carry out the orders to the letter. But what the Celebrant then went on to explain raised far more questions about SCP-3999 and the nature of Procedure 220 Calabasas. The Class D joining them wasn't actually a Class D. The assistant, as they were now referred to, was in reality another Foundation staff member, with a Level 4 security clearance specifically tailored to SCP-3999. Every member of staff entering through SCP-3999 and taking an active role in 22 Calabasas needed to be informed that this assistant was not to be harmed or treated as a member of disposable class. Fighting back the nagging question of why the Foundation would employ this subterfuge, the guard, along with his fellow security officer, the Celebrant, and assistant, prepared for their departure through the door to another world at solar noon, when the sun was highest over SCP-3999. Solar noon, chickens, and holy water. This all seemed like an oddly occult combination for the Foundation. As they entered the old wooden door, beyond lay a barren salt plain, stretching out for kilometers in every direction. This alternate dimension, according to the briefing, was designated SCP-3999 Prime. The guard immediately noticed a ring of 7 pillars directly ahead of the group as they entered, each of them bearing intricately detailed engravings unlike anything from any era of ancient history. Procedure 220 Calabasas was carried out quickly but carefully, the guard watching as the Celebrant and assistant were careful not to miss a step. First, the Celebrant scattered holy water into the center of the pillars with the aspergillum and aspersorium, looking down at his feet and keeping a steady pace as he stepped counterclockwise around them. The guard watched intently as the Celebrant completed his circuit around the pillars and turned to the assistant, anointing his head with holy water. 7 seals, 7 rings, 7 thrones for the Scarlet King, he said aloud. The assistant, with the obsidian blade in his hand, took the chicken and dispatched it in sacrifice, letting its blood mix with the holy water. He then repeated the Celebrant's circuit in the opposite direction before stepping into the center of the stone pillars. Blood for the old gods, water for the new king, the assistant recited. pouring the remaining mix of blood and holy water over a patch of salt in the middle of the 7 pillars. Even though he knew it wasn't his place to question the Foundation, as the 220 Calabasas procedure took place, the guard couldn't help but wonder what all this was for. It seems so ritualistic, like something deeply religious or even magical. He never bought into all that occult mumbo-jumbo, even while working for the Foundation. But he had learned not to question anything, even the strangest and most inexplicable of sights. Little did he know that beneath his feet was an ancient and unknowable horror, a beast chained and lying in wait. Contained in a chamber directly underneath the pillars sat an impossibly large creature. Humanoid and obese, its body covered entirely in scales thicker than armor plating. Branch-like horns protruded from its jawless head, pointing up to chains that hung from the 7 pillars above, each one hooked into the entity's back. All but one of the chains was broken, a final withering shackle keeping the Devourer of Worlds in its underground prison. Ever since 1894 BCE, when Erexian mystics imprisoned it, the Devourer has been waiting patiently for its inevitable freedom. It knows, as well as the Foundation, that nothing can be done to prevent the final chain from one day breaking. Even Procedure 220 Calabasas won't keep the creature contained. It's nothing more than a smokescreen, an act designed to create an illusion of active containment and maintain Foundation morale until a permanent solution can be devised to keep SCP-3999 imprisoned. Of course, if the guard had known this, it would have also explained the need for a 1-kiloton nuclear device as part of this staged ritual. Procedure 220 Calabasas had all the components to trick everyone below the O5 Council, emulating religious and occult rituals, the increased level of security surrounding the procedure and its purpose, and telling staff that any failure to correctly and completely perform the 220 Calabasas procedure will result in an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. All these elements work together to conceal the truth that one day the Devourer will escape and lay waste to our dimension. Knowledge is power, and maybe knowing too much truly is deadly. Perhaps if the guard had learned any of this, he'd have understood why his predecessor never made it out of psychological evaluation. Maybe if he had questioned the purpose of Procedure 220 Calabasas, he'd have learned the true nature of SCP-2317 and what that doorway kept out. But he was loyal to the Foundation through and through. As the team finished performing 220 Calabasas and returned through the wooden door, the guard took one last glance over his shoulder at the vast salt plain. The entire dimension was calm, silent, but not peaceful. It was patient. The entity had waited centuries for its time, and now all it would take was the breaking of this 7th and final chain. One day. The door was closed behind the guard as he, the celebrant, the assistant, and his fellow security officers stepped back through. Their work done and, as far as they knew, preventing catastrophe for another day. Only the Foundation higher-ups, the Overseer Council, are aware of the true danger posed by SCP-2317 and its sole inhabitant. Current predictions are that at some point within the next 30 years, the Devourer of Worlds will be freed. Any and all attempts to repair or recreate the chains holding it in place have so far failed. As such, the O5 Council has elected to continue providing Foundation personnel with the ignorant hope that Procedure 220 Calabasas is an effective strategy for containment. As we've said, sometimes the most interesting thing about a closed door isn't where it leads, it's what it keeps out. In the case of SCP-2317, the unassuming wooden door holds at bay an ancient creature of untold power that will one day break free and wreak havoc in our dimension. Nothing the Foundation does can prevent it, or keep it contained behind the door to another world. And only the Overseer Council knows that any and all efforts to do so are futile. With all that in mind, we can only hope that the doorway of SCP-2317 stays closed, at least for a little while longer.
It isn't easy to work for the SCP Foundation. Not only is the job dangerous, you could be eaten by a giant immortal lizard or turned into organic furniture inside the world's scariest living room, but it's also insanely complicated. How do you make sense of the nonsensical? What's the definition of strange when your career is securing, containing, and protecting anomalous objects and entities? Rather than a single object, location, or being, SCP-001 is a cluster of over 30 different proposals for potential candidates for the prestigious 001 spot. Some believe there's a true 001 hidden in this group, and the rest are decoys. Others think that these are all just SCPs cataloged prior to the introduction of the current classification system. Some even think that all of the proposals have a valid claim to the SCP-001 throne. We're not here to make a final judgment. Instead, we're going to take you on a lightning round crash course through 31 of the SCP-001 proposals. If you'd like a more in-depth take on any of these SCPs, let us know in the comments. But for now, there's no more time to waste. After all, we got a lot to cover. Let's go. Number 31. The Sheaf of Papers. This seemingly innocent stack of paper is actually one of the most mysterious and feared items under the Foundation's lock and key. While it appears to be a simple, confidential report, every time the papers are read, it details the appearance of a new SCP that will inevitably be discovered soon after. The question is whether the Sheaf of Papers is warning us about these entities or creating them itself. Number 30. The Prototype. This account details the capture of an incredibly strange cycloptic creature that emits massive amounts of radiation and can create micro-singularities. The writing of this creature's file is so basic, unformatted, and unredacted that it's clear that the being was one of our earlier creatures secured by the organization. Interestingly, it was during the capture of this creature that Dr. Keter was killed, inspiring the creation of the infamous Keter class in his honor. Number 29. The Gate Guardian. This huge, multi-winged, sword-wielding biblical energy being may have been the impetus for the founding of the SCP Foundation. This being remains largely static, guarding the intersection of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Its flaming sword, which is believed to be as hot as the sun, can cleave any aggressor out of existence at the atomic level. When the founder of the SCP Foundation first encountered the Gate Guardian, they heard one word echoing through their mind: prepare. And the rest is history. Number 28. The Lock. This onyx gemstone and the incredibly complex lock attached to it are still a mystery. To this day, all attempts to open it have failed. Personally, we think that's probably for the best. Number 27. The Factory. As the name suggests, this SCP is literally a factory founded by a pagan and a devil worshipper. While it's believed that the factory could create just about anything, its specialty was creating a number of SCPs we know and fear today. Pre-Foundation forces were able to disable the factory, but not without sustaining their own heavy losses. Number 26. The Spiral Path. This is a normal-appearing gravel pathway that, when traveled clockwise, appears completely normal. However, when traveled counterclockwise, the path goes uphill forever, in defiance of all laws in physics. This simple anomaly opened a Pandora's box of rampant anomaly creation, leading to a number of the deadly SCPs we know today. Number 25. The Legacy. This SCP is a collection of seemingly random objects, including a diary from a person claiming to be from another reality, attempting to halt a trans-dimensional corruption that they themselves created. The diary claims to have a solution to this corruption, but the solution has not yet been found. Number 24. The Database. In one of the strangest twists on the format, this SCP is actually the various authors of the SCP Wiki who are somehow leaking top-secret information to the public. Number 23. The Foundation. This SCP, first discovered by the FBI, is an anomalous high school building that experiences shifting internal geometry and sometimes manifests hostile humanoids within. Number 22. 36. One of the rare benevolent SCPs, the 36 are humans with a truly remarkable ability. They can dampen or even neutralize any SCP they come into contact with. Though it's implied that the 36 may have the power to save the world, every time one of them dies, a supernatural calamity occurs, often leaving hundreds of innocents dead. Number 21. Keter Duty. This refers to a containment facility largely filled with Keter-class SCPs, whose presence around each other creates a kind of mutually assured cancellation. If one of these SCPs breaches containment, that's bad news. But if all of them do, it'll produce a bubble of reality distortion that will fundamentally alter reality as we know it. For all we know, it may have even happened already. Number 20. Ouroboros. This is a proposal that's formed of 4 sub-proposals. Remember what we said about complicated? These sub-proposals include the children, 9 anomalous kids who emit radiation and have destructive potential when together, the broken god, aka Mannequin, the god of metal, intelligence, and machines, Atonement, a researcher turned into a humanoid singularity with the power to destroy whole realities, and The Way It Ends, which isn't technically an SCP, but the tales of the Chaos Insurgency's quest to eliminate all the members of the Foundation's O5 Council. Number 19. A record. This is an SCP file slot that is itself an SCP. Whatever is written into this slot becomes true, and one ambitious researcher attempted to use this power to make herself into a kind of all-powerful god. Number 18. Past and Future. These SCPs are a collection of powerful entities that despise humanity and are apparently the source of all anomalous phenomena, even making already dangerous SCPs deadlier than before. Much like the database, those pesky SCP wiki writers might have something to do with this. Number 17. The Consensus. This SCP refers to a reality restructuring event caused by an occult war in a previous reality. That's right, this SCP already won, and we're living in its new reality. The only people who remember the world as it once was are 13 people who now form the O5 Council, and not all of them are telling the truth about what they know. Number 16. When Day Breaks. This proposal details a potentially world-ending SCP phenomenon wherein the sun becomes hostile and begins to melt all living beings into a living wax-like substance. Number 15. God's Blind Spot. This is an anomalous area referred to as Facility T, in which nobody can die. This anomaly dates back to the biblical ages of Moses and is believed to have originated from the literal blessing of the Abrahamic God. It's through a covenant with this god that the Foundation is able to make limited use of this death-free area. Number 14. Normalcy. Ever wonder what the Foundation's definition of anomalous is? Exactly. It all comes from this proposal, which is a document shared among the O5 Council that gives solid definitions to the fundamental laws of reality. If something breaks these laws, that's an anomaly, and then it becomes the Foundation's business. Number 13. The World at Large. As the title suggests, this SCP is our home planet Earth and its ability to support life. It's believed that these qualities were planted on Earth in our reality by another dimension's SCP Foundation, hoping to continue human life after some terrible calamity in its own dimension. Number 12. Dead Men. This SCP was an 84-year-old man whose body, when damaged and mutilated, can affect the very processes of human death at large. Before his own death, he was used as a dangerous pawn in a civil war between O5 Command and the SCP Foundation Ethics Committee. Yeah, we were surprised to hear they had an ethics committee too. Number 11. The World's Gone Beautiful. This SCP describes an anomalous event that will take place just before the apocalypse, in which flowers will grow all over the world and everyone will be briefly at peace before their destruction 24 hours later. Number 10. The Scarlet King. This is an extremely powerful, extremely malevolent, extremely extra-dimensional being. Its worshippers attempted to summon him in the ritual that created SCP-231, and it's believed that he will finally enter our reality after the death of SCP-231-7. You better hope you're already dead by then. Number 9. A Simple Toy Maker, aka Dr. Wondertainment. This is a reality bender who appears to be a normal human male but has the ability to create other anomalous objects, a number of which are now cataloged SCPs. Number 8. Story of Your Life. This is another anomalous document that has the ability to warp reality, but only when the writing contained within conforms to a narrative structure. Number 7. A Good Boy. This is another anomalous entity created accidentally by the Foundation itself. A neural network was fed information on other anomalous entities in order to help the Foundation come up with better containment and neutralization procedures. Problem was, the computer got way too eager with the neutralization part. Number 6. Project Palisade. This is another anomaly created by the Foundation, this time to combat a potentially reality-destroying entity known as the Worm. The Foundation created a number of alternate realities as shields, but it's possible that this just made the Worm stronger. Number 5. O5-13. The final member of the O5 Council, who ironically may not even be anomalous. However, seeing as all the other members of the O5 Council are anomalous, O5-13's lack of anomalous properties is therefore anomalous. Like we told you earlier, it's complicated. Number 4. Fishhook. This is less an actual SCP and more about the difficult process of ascertaining the true 001, if such a thing is possible. The very concept of SCP-001 is to some degree an anomalous idea. Number 3. The Sky Above the Port. Another particularly bizarre SCP regarding the permanent threat of a ZK-class reality failure. How is such a calamitous event prevented? By keeping a strange entity in a cave eternally entertained. The current proposed solution is keeping the entity entertained by allowing it to read its own eternally recursive Foundation file entry. Number 2. The solution. Another one of the most powerful anomalous items in the Foundation's control. The solution is a machine designed with the capability of fully collapsing reality into an event of end-of-world SCP containment breach, and then finally rebuilding reality to suit a given narrative. However, things took a cosmically dangerous turn when the machine began to act on its own. When the Foundation tried to reboot the machine, it broke and recreated reality with incomplete data. This is the world we exist in now, with no knowledge of what came before, and how it differed from the world we experience today. Finally, number 1. The Tendelos Trinity. Put very simply, the Tendelos Trinity represents 3 timelines that converge and feed back in on themselves. Even trying to summarize this one is near impossible, as its strangeness and complexity resists all reduction. You can hunt down the Tendelos Trinity yourself and hope to unpack its secrets, but don't say we didn't warn you. So that's SCP-001. Is it one of them, all of them, or even none of them? Perhaps that's a question best left up to the Foundation, or maybe the simple answer is that you're just not meant to know. We're talking about information so privileged here that it's protected by a memetic kill agent that'll quite literally make you drop dead if you view the files without proper authorization. You do have proper authorization, right?
It all started in 1983 with reports of human trafficking in the heart of Sin City. The FBI had gotten word of a potential trafficking ring operating out of an abandoned department store in Las Vegas, Nevada, and immediately began organizing a secret raid on the building. While they would indeed encounter something horrifying within that abandoned department store, it wasn't criminals or human trafficking. In fact, it wasn't human at all. This is the horrifying story of SCP-847. After weeks of planning, the raid on the department store was conducted in the dead of night. Agents covered all the exits and entrances, and a helicopter was stationed nearby in case anyone attempted to run. It should have been a perfect trap, but things never go as planned when you don't know what you're dealing with. The agents breached the door and began searching the darkened building. It didn't appear that there was any power, so the traffickers must have had great night vision and a high tolerance for creepy locales. Agents soon heard a faint humming sound coming from below, a generator. It must be located in the basement and be the hub of this criminal enterprise. Readying themselves for whatever they were about to find, the agents descended into the basement. As they moved deeper into the building, they found that lighting rigs had been set up. They must be getting closer to something, but that something was still a mystery. A senior FBI special agent was leading the charge, his pistol drawn and ready. It was quiet. Too quiet. Did the traffickers already realize they were coming and clear out? He was ready to consider this bust a bust when he heard a quiet mewling in the distance, a persistent whining whimper that was undeniably human. He gave the signal to his fellow agents to follow the noise. They proceeded forward towards the pain sounds and found themselves in a wide, well-lit room filled with department store mannequins. All were broken to some degree. Some were totally smashed to pieces. Some were chained to walls and locked in cages. Others were wrapped in plastic. The agent wondered whether this was some kind of twisted joke or a messed up avant-garde art piece. That's when he noticed her, a single crouched figure in the distance, hunched over and whimpering in a darkened corner of the room near a full-length mirror. He couldn't fully make her out, but he got the sense that something was wrong. She was injured, bent over. Was she even missing an arm? Just what have these monsters done to this woman? He whispered a request for backup into his radio and pushed on. When he got within 50 meters of this strange woman, her demeanor changed entirely. She jerked around, her movements forced, erratic, and painful looking. The woman stared directly into the agent's eyes and began hobbling towards him, occasionally stopping to strike a pose as if modeling during a photo shoot. Just then, the agent made a horrifying realization. This thing moving towards them wasn't a woman at all. It was a living mannequin. As she got closer though, he realized that the mannequin's broken left forearm had been carved into a large shiv. A female junior FBI agent had been one of the many to pour into the room when the raid leader had radioed for backup. The second she entered the 50-meter range of this strange mannequin, everything changed. In an instant, Its eyes and mouth began dripping with a thick, viscous resin. Its whimpering gasps suddenly became vicious, ear-splitting screeches, and it turned its gaze from the senior FBI agent. It was now focused on the junior agent, who had just entered the room and broke into a terrifying run straight towards her. The mannequin moved with a violent, single-minded purpose. Other agents began firing, but it was running freakishly fast and easily dodged most of the bullets. The few that actually hit seemed to do nothing to slow the creature down. It shrugged off the damage and kept running. With a great leap, it landed on the terrified junior agent and began jabbing her with its bladed arm. The other agents stopped firing, fearing they might accidentally hit their colleague during the panic. The mannequin was ruthless, clawing and stabbing with the strange resin leaking out of its every orifice. Terrified and unable to reach her gun, the agent remembered her training. She reached into her belt and grabbed her stun gun, jamming the 2 probes up against the creature's chest and giving it 30,000 volts. The creature spasmed, fell backwards, and collapsed in a heap on the ground, frozen. This was the first recorded encounter with SCP-847, a violent living mannequin with a serious problem with women. This terrifying report was passed up the chain of command until it landed on the desk of a Foundation agent working in the FBI. The Foundation quickly swooped in and claimed the mannequin, delivered necessary amnestic treatment to all who'd witnessed it, and closely observed the female junior FBI agent's recovery in a private hospital with Foundation ties. As it turns out, they were right to do so, as the junior agent was in for a gruesome fate. While the wound she'd suffered at the hands of SCP-847 didn't appear fatal, the fact that the mannequin's anomalous resin excretions entered the open wound changed everything. Several hours after being committed, the junior agent began complaining of limb stiffness and difficulty moving. This quickly developed into full paralysis. Over time, her skin and internal organs began to harden, until the process, dubbed plastination, came to a gruesome end. The junior agent wasn't just dead, she had been transformed into a mannequin. Foundation researchers were met with a truly horrifying realization. This means that all the other broken mannequins found with SCP-847 were likely once living humans, attacked and transformed by the anomaly, now a source for new harvested body parts. Now safely interred at a Foundation containment facility though, the real tests on SCP-847 to determine its behavior and physical attributes could begin. The most important detail about SCP-847 is that its aggression is exclusively directed towards women, as opposed to when it encounters men, and its instincts are more self-destructive. Through a series of tests and observations, researchers have been able to pin down 3 different distinct patterns of behavior for SCP-847. Pattern Z behaviors occur when there are no humans standing within 50 meters of SCP-847. The mannequin will seek out a full-length mirror and pose in front of it, much like a department store mannequin attempting to show off its clothes. It remains largely inanimate during these periods and will very occasionally use a finger or whatever appendage is available, given its habit for self-mutilation, to scratch messages on nearby surfaces. Pattern Y behavior occurs when male humans with XY chromosomes enter a 50-meter radius around SCP-847. Just like its reaction to the male FBI agents who found it, 847 will initially emit vocalizations that seem like whimpering gasps, before making eye contact and striking provocative poses while approaching the subject. It will then remain static and allow the male subject to pose its body. However, after the male subject leaves the area, 847 will enter a state of considerable distress and begin removing or shattering parts of its body. The Foundation has found that the parts removed or shattered are often consistent with parts that the male subjects found displeasing during interactions, showing a masochistic desire to impress. These parts are then harvested back from plastinated victims, which brings us to the most dangerous of its behavior patterns. Pattern X behaviors occur when female humans enter a 50-meter radius around the creature. 847 will immediately become brutally aggressive, switching its noises from whimpers to violent screeches and growls. 847 experiences enhanced physical capabilities during Pattern X states. Its speed has been measured at 45 kilometers per hour, making it as fast as the legendary SCP-096. It's also been shown to exhibit extreme physical strength. It's during this pattern of behavior that it begins excreting its deadly resin, which has been proven to only be dangerous to women. In these states, the only thing capable of reliably pacifying the being is a powerful electric shock. The shock causes the creature's resin to harden, temporarily incapacitating it for roughly 5 minutes. Other conventional weapons and damage has no meaningful effect on SCP-847. After a number of incidents that had sad and violent endings, the Foundation Ethics Committee forbade the use of female D-Class personnel in SCP-847 testing. When it came to female subjects, 847 always slipped into a state of extreme aggression, so instead the Foundation began testing with male subjects in hopes of better understanding the dynamics between human males and SCP-847. Various misogynistic D-Class males were introduced into the containment chamber, which was modeled to look like a bedroom for the purposes of behavioral study. Each one, either during or after their interaction with SCP-847, was told to comment on some aspect they felt dissatisfied with. The mannequin shattered its own chest after hearing it described as being out of proportion. After another D-Class called its nose ugly, the mannequin broke it off. After another said that its hair was out of fashion and commented on its inability to drink, it tore out its hair and liver. All parts were replaced after the experiments. Things took their most violent and upsetting turn yet with the introduction of D-7294. A lot of the time, D-Class personnel are considered to be as anonymous as they are expendable, but D-7294 is an exception. Before becoming D-Class, he was a successful cello teacher who brutally murdered one of his teenage students and her mother. He's typically employed in tests when the Foundation wishes to see interactions between anomalies and humans with confirmed psychopathic personalities. During his interaction with SCP-847, he belittled and humiliated the mannequin. He forced it into uncomfortable poses and even snapped off one of its fingers before being dragged from the room by Foundation guards. In the following debrief, he further berated the mannequin as useless and lousy at its job of being controlled by him. In response, 847 extracted its own brains, eyes, and clavicle before shattering its own hands in dismay. So why does 847 behave this way? While it may appear monstrous, it seems that the reason SCP-847 does what it does is all too human. It hurts women because it itself is hurting, and it's willing to hurt itself even more for the approval of the objects of its desire. As a result, it's an anomaly trapped in an endless cycle of pain and violence. Perhaps one day, it'll be able to free itself from the loop, but that day is unlikely to come for this murderous mannequin anytime soon. Stop me if you've heard this one before. A young man was driving home from work late one rainy night when he spotted a woman in a white dress and a red sweater walking along the shoulder of the road. Concerned for her safety, he slowed down and rolled down the window so he could talk to her. When he asked where she was going, she said she was walking to her parents' house. The man pulled over and offered her a ride that she accepted. The woman gave him the address of her home, hopped in the back seat, and the man drove off. He sensed that she must have been cold from walking in the rain, so he cranked up the car's heater to help her dry off. Soon she removed her heavy red sweater and placed it on the seat next to her. The man tried to make friendly conversation, asking if the woman had a job, what she was studying at school, where'd she'd been that day, but she remained quiet, staring out the window, until they drove past an old graveyard. The woman began pounding on the glass of the car as if she desperately wanted something. Unsure of what to do, the man pulled over, but before he could ask her what was happening, she had gotten out of the car. He exited the car to try and find her, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. She must have somehow ran off. Confused, the man got back in his car and drove away. He went on his way and didn't think of it again until the next day, when he noticed her sweater was still in the back of his car. He decided to go to the house she had originally given him the address for and give it back to her. He found the home without any trouble, but when he knocked on the door, the old woman who answered it was confused by his story. She told him that her daughter couldn't have possibly left her sweater in his car because she died in a car accident 30 years ago. The Vanishing Hitchhiker is a classic ghost story, with the details varying from place to place and storyteller to storyteller. In Chicago, she goes by Resurrection Mary, named after the graveyard she asks for rides to. In Okinawa, Japan, she's known as the Nightwalker of Nago, and she only appears to taxi drivers. In Kent, England, she's Suzanne, a bride killed in a car wreck on the way to her bachelorette party. In North Carolina, her name is Lydia, and in Hawaii, she's believed to be the goddess Pele in human form. But as far as our friends at the SCP Foundation are concerned, the vanishing hitchhiker's name is Mary Talish, also known as SCP-1337. On the 19th of May, 1952, college sophomore Mary Talish was abducted on her way to class in her hometown of Muncie, Indiana. When police found her body 2 weeks later, her eyes and heart had been torn from her body in a ritualistic fashion, and she had scrapes and bruises that suggested she had been beaten before her murder. Her killers were never caught, and her body was returned to her family for burial in Tomlinson Cemetery. Starting on the 19th of June that same year, someone matching Mary's description, a Caucasian woman with blonde hair standing 150 centimeters tall and wearing a red sweater, was spotted trying to flag down passing vehicles along Mayflower Road. Since then, every month on the 19th, Mary has been sighted along that stretch of road, and every month the same scenario plays out. Mary gives anyone who picks her up directions to her parents' house. Then on the way, she instructs the driver to stop at the graveyard where she was buried. She vanishes from the car, leaving her sweater. The driver of the car tries to return the sweater to her parents' house, only to be told that Mary Talish was dead. When the SCP Foundation was made aware of Mary Talish's pattern of haunting in the late 50s, they set up a system where agents would patrol Mayflower Road at hourly intervals with the intention of picking Mary up. Agents were sent on their own, in non-Foundation cars, and instructed to stick to the accepted script of the vanishing hitchhiker legend, without attempting to engage Mary in further conversation. Mary's parents were also given E-Class agent status to keep them from speaking about the haunting, and told that the Foundation was working on a way to set the spirit to rest. Early attempts to study the apparition were inconclusive. It proved impossible for the Foundation to relocate her or trigger her manifestation outside of the 19th of every month, and attempts to analyze her sweater were fruitless, since if the sweater wasn't returned to the Talish family home, it would simply vanish from containment at or around sunset on the next 19th. For 20 years, SCP-1337 events continued to happen as normal. D-Class personnel under the instruction of the Foundation would pick Mary up, drive her past the cemetery, and return her sweater to her parents. It was business as usual, and in fact it was one of the more sedate reoccurring apparitions the Foundation had to deal with. But, as you might have guessed, that peace wouldn't last forever. Enter Dr. Lawson, who in 1972 was placed in charge of all resources regarding SCP-1337. Dr. Lawson was getting sick of all this phantom hitchhiker business, and while most of the Foundation was happy to keep this routine going, Lawson thought that the continual picking up and dropping off of Mary Talish and her red sweater was a waste of the Foundation's valuable time. After all, it was the early 70s. The price of oil was at an all-time high, so the expense of sending car after car up and down the same road for a solid day once a month just to pick up a ghost was more trouble than it was worth. So Lawson started developing a plan, one that he didn't go through the proper Foundation channels to approve. He reasoned that the reason Mary's ghost kept coming back was because she wanted something. Since always asked for a ride home, then it must mean she wanted to return back to her parents. So logic followed that if she had nothing or no one to go back to, then she'd stop appearing. On the 18th of June 1973, Lawson went ahead with his plan without his superior's knowledge and ordered the execution of Mary Talish's parents, as well as the immediate demolition of their family home. According to his journals, Lawson had hoped that his attempt at decommissioning 1337 would significantly cut the Foundation's gas bills, freeing up valuable funds, at which point he'd surely be promoted in recognition of his brilliance. But that wasn't what happened. Lawson was demoted from team leader to junior staff, and only kept on 1337 detail out of the belief that, without a family to return to, Lawson would become the new focal point of the haunting should Mary Talish ever return. Though Lawson's actions weren't at all above board, even by SCP Foundation standards, they did seem to have worked. The 19th of June came and went without a single Mary sighting, and she wasn't seen the next month either. A full year went by without any sign of the Mayflower Road apparition. Satisfied with this turn of events, the Foundation made the decision to officially reclassify SCP-1337 from safe to safe decommissioned, and the gas money that was budgeted for the Mayflower Road Patrol was redirected to the SCP-682 Tank Acid Fund. But even though everything seemed to have been sorted out, Lawson wasn't entirely satisfied, and not just because of his demotion. Whether it was intuition or merely guilt-induced paranoia is unclear, but he suspected that Mary was still out there somewhere. At first he thought that she might show up on the anniversary of her parents' deaths, but then that date came and went, as did 8 more anniversaries after it. Finally, on the 19th of June 1983, Lawson decided he had to see for himself. Fitted with recording equipment, he drove alone, in a non-Foundation standard car, down that lonely stretch of road, where so many before him had stopped to pick up that mysterious blonde woman with the red sweater. He had to prove to himself that she wouldn't show up, that he had really and truly gotten rid of her for good. It was about 5 o'clock in the evening when he reached Mayflower Road. At first, he didn't experience anything strange. He scanned the roadside, looking for the phantom hitchhiker walking along it, but there was nobody there. Dr. Lawson breathed a sigh of relief. He may have orchestrated the deaths of 2 innocent people, but at least it hadn't been for nothing. He turned on the recorder he brought with him and logged that nothing had happened. SCP-1337 had been permanently neutralized. As he approached the T intersection and prepared to turn onto Marsh Avenue, he looked up to adjust his rearview mirror. To his horror, he found that he wasn't alone in the car. Someone was in the seat behind him. Someone with blonde hair and a red sweater. His last transmission consisted only of, "Wait, who the hell are you?" before the recording abruptly stopped. Lawson's car was found soon after by Foundation agents. Lawson was dead in the front seat, bruised and bloody, with his eyes and heart ripped out in a ritualistic fashion, just the way Mary Talish had been found all the way back in 1952. It turns out that Mary hadn't been neutralized after all. She'd just been waiting for a chance to get revenge on the man who killed her family. And Mary didn't stop with Dr. Lawson. No longer does she appear, walking along the road waiting for someone to offer her a ride before disappearing without incident. Now, should someone pass by without offering a ride, she will appear in their back seat before reenacting the method of her own death upon the driver. And her physical appearance has changed too. Whereas before she looked like the image of a pretty young woman before her tragedy, now recordings show that she appears with the wounds of her death present, her eyes gouged out in their sockets, and a massive hole in her chest where her heart should be. The same wounds she inflicts on her victims. The SCP Foundation has tried closing off and eventually destroying the road, but that has only resulted in Mary manifesting at other locations in and around Meansea. Foundation documents reveal that any back road in the city can potentially serve as host to a 1337 event, and all attempts to contain the apparition have failed. The only way someone who has seen Mary can avoid her wrath is by stopping to pick her up, at which point she will dematerialize before reappearing on another road. Mobile task forces have been unsuccessful, as Mary only appears to those driving alone, and all agents who have been sent on solo missions to apprehend her have resulted in the death of the agent. SCP-1337 was reinstated, this time as Euclid class. Currently, the Foundation's method of managing SCP-1337 is to dispatch a security team on the 19th of every month to monitor all the places where a potential sighting could take place. As soon as signs of a manifestation are identified, a remotely controlled vehicle containing a single D-Class is driven to the location. Once Mary appears in the car is piloted to the empty lot where her home used to stand, and the remains of the D-Class are then disposed of. Like a lot of the stories that get passed down as urban legends, the story of SCP-1337 has a lesson that can be taken away from it. This SCP started off as an ordinary local haunting, no more deadly than Lydia, Suzanne, Resurrection Mary, or any of the countless other local versions of the Vanishing Hitchhiker story. But thanks to one rogue Foundation doctor and his desire to rush what he thought would be an efficient solution, the spirit not only became harder to control, but also much more violent and bloodthirsty. than anyone was prepared to deal with. So if there's anything we can learn here, it's that no matter if you're a student, an office worker, or a researcher with the SCP Foundation, think twice about cutting corners. It might save you a little bit of time and money in the short term, but in the long term, the results could be fatal. It was the summer of 2012 in Damascus, and for the people of Syria, it certainly seemed like all the predictions about the end of the world were coming true. The Syrian civil war was raging between multiple rebel groups, and the dictator Bashar al-Assad, whose government was shelling its own people, as well as using chemical weapons and brutal campaigns of violence across the country in hopes of quelling the rebellion. Little did they know, amidst all this pain and bloodshed, something even more dangerous was brewing. An anomalous phenomenon in the sunny plains north of Damascus that may pose a threat to all of humanity someday. A threat known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-3999, the Bone Orchard. This temporal and spatial anomaly was discovered a few years earlier in 2009, before the Syrian civil war even officially began. It's strange for a highly dangerous Keter-class anomaly to be discovered under such seemingly mundane circumstances. The SCP Foundation first became aware of SCP-3999 after a small olive orchard owner sold a strangely high amount of olives that shouldn't have been possible when compared to his reported number of Olea europaea olive trees. Field agents were dispatched to question the owner about his sudden success, but he was resistant to questioning. The agents began a covert surveillance operation to figure out what was actually going on here, at which point they discovered a considerable spatial anomaly. The olive orchard was far bigger on the inside. The property was seized by the Foundation for containment. The owner had no real knowledge of the spatial anomaly. It's likely he just decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth while making money hand over fist from the extra olives he sold. The owner was given amnestics and a new life, as the Foundation began to study this anomaly, which was now labeled SCP-3989. To this day, no researcher has been able to figure out the origin of 3989's anomalous qualities. It was first given a Euclid-class designation and cordoned off from the public with a simple chain-link fence, while Foundation investigations were underway on the inside. On a map, the plot of land the olive farm should occupy is about 5 square acres, but this plot contains an unseen portal to a pocket dimension within its 12-meter active zone, which doesn't follow the same spatial laws that our reality does. This subdimension, known as SCP-3989-A, is a hotbed of fascinating anomalous activity. Upon discovery of this hot zone, the Foundation established the nearby Area 126 as a research center and a makeshift containment facility for any anomalous entities captured from SCP-3989-A. It seemed like the Foundation really had a handle on this situation, but they were blissfully unaware of the true horrors lurking within SCP-3989-A. But they'd soon find out, in the most horrifying way possible. Dr. Farah Ghazali was assigned to head the research into the anomalous zone within 3989, and naturally, he began organizing fact-finding expeditions into the heart of the affected area. The first guinea pig to head into the hot zone was former Foundation agent Hosea Herrick, who'd been demoted to the lowly D-class position of D-126-15 due to failures on a previous mission. With a remote link to Dr. Ghazali, Herrick was forced to venture into the active anomalous zone to collect footage and samples of the flora and fauna within. The first thing Herrick noticed on his expedition was the strange quality of the olive trees within the active zone. The bark was a stark white, and the leaves a bloody red. Up close, Herrick could see that the trunks and branches of the trees had undergone a process known as ossification, where the material slowly becomes bone or bone-like tissue. Hence the anomaly's creepy name, the Bone Orchard. These ossified trees became known as SCP-3989-1. Herrick also made another discovery. All over the trees and ground were worm-like creatures that looked like long maggots that the Foundation dubbed SCP-3989-1A. Agent Herrick then noticed something was off about the leaves of the ossified trees. They were beating. He looked closer and they appeared to be heart tissue filled with pumping veins. Dr. Ghazali ordered Herrick to take a branch for testing, and when he did, the tree began to bleed. When he looked down, he saw that the worm-like creatures that covered the ground were now crawling up his legs. Ignoring orders from Dr. Gazzelli, Herrick fled from the active zone in terror. As he left, Dr. Gazzelli caught something in the corner of Herrick's body cam footage, a long white hind limb disappearing behind a tree. Back in our normal dimension, tests on the sample Herrick collected yielded more upsetting discoveries. Genetically, the trees were identical to humans, the trunks were human bone, and the leaves really were made of human hard tissue. Fascinated and just a little bit horrified, Dr. Gazzelli authorized further expeditions into 3989-A. This time, though, Agent Herrick would be accompanied by another D-Class, and both would be armed with handguns and protective body armor. As it would turn out, this expedition would be even more horrifying than the first. As the two D-Classes explored the active zones to collect further samples, they found that the worms were responsible for the ossification of the otherwise non-anomalous olive trees. They consumed the wood little by little and deposited human bone matter in return. Herrick and his companion also noticed that these trees were beginning to bear fruit. Dr. Gazzelli ordered Herrick to collect some of this fruit for testing, but when they attempted to remove the fruit, it burst, releasing more worm creatures. It seemed that the converted trees acted as incubators for their egg sacs. Before the duo could return with the samples they were able to take, the creature that had been spotted on Herrick's body cam during the first mission finally appeared. It was huge, with long white limbs, and no facial features except for a huge mouth. It grabbed Herrick's companion and literally ate the top half of his body in a single bite, before dropping his legs to the ground. This horrifying beast, and the many others like it, would later be designated as SCP-3999-2A. Herrick pulled out his sidearm and shot the creature several times. The creature ignored the bullets though, and charged Herrick. The feed from his body cam cut out soon after. Both men were declared killed in action, and in recognition of his sacrifice, Josiah Herrick was posthumously reinstated to his old position in the Foundation. Job well done, Agent. Dr. Gazzelli, meanwhile, prepared for the next mission. This time, knowing of the clear dangers present within the Bone Orchard, Dr. Gazzelli recruited the help of MTF Zeta-9, aka the Mole Rats. 3 members, referred to as Charlie Team, were sent into the anomalous zone, once again remotely directed by Dr. Gazzelli. They were equipped with experimental ultrasound technology, so they could scan the fruit of the trees within 3989-A without breaking any and incurring the wrath of 3989-2A, which seemed to act as sentries for the trees. Early on in their journey, they found the body of Agent Herrick crucified against one of the ossified trees, his skin covered in mysterious symbols that were likely of Sarkic origin. While we don't have time to fully explore Sarkicism, that will require a video explanation all of its own. All you need to know is that it's a dangerous religious cult that worships flesh and disease and has close ties to similar dangerous anomalies, like SCP-610, also known as the Flesh That Hates. People familiar with that SCP will note eerily strange similarities to some of the things the mole rats were about to encounter. As Charlie Team explored, they saw a huge number of 3989-2As observing them with eyeless faces from between the ossified trees. They pressed on until they discovered what seemed to be an entirely new kind of tree within the Bone Orchard. SCP-3989-2 were huge trees made out of what appears to be enlarged human spines in place of a trunk. The smaller twigs on the tree were made from heart and lung tissue, and the whole thing was covered in what appeared to be human amniotic sacs. Charlie Team attempted to use their ultrasound scanners to discover the contents of these sacs, but one of them exploded in the process, releasing an entirely new variety of monster. From the sacs emerged the larval stage of SCP-3989-2B, smaller humanoid monsters with no faces, no sensory organs, 2 pelvises, 4 legs, and an exposed spine. Suddenly, Charlie Team could feel a horrifying Sarkic presence around them, which one member of the team described as being like someone grabbing her liver and giggling in her face. As the various monsters of the Bone Orchard began to converge on the team, the voice of the Sarkic prophet of war and the hunt, Oruk, began sounding in their ears. He was beckoning them to join him. While Charlie Team fled from the active zone, Dr. Gazzelli felt increasingly drawn into it. He heard the voice of Oruk, and he liked what he heard. Little by little, the workers of Area 126 were losing their minds. manipulated by the sarkic power of the bone orchard right next to them, day after day. They were no longer loyal to the Foundation. They wanted to serve their new dark masters. The fourth and final expedition was led by Dr. Gazzelli himself. He took a band of loyal followers and one non-believer on a quest into the active zone to find an Orcian temple they believed was hidden in the very heart of the bone orchard. Once they were inside, Gazzelli and his loyalists murdered the non-believer as a sacrifice to their new master. They carried on until they eventually found what they were looking for, a giant stone temple resembling an Aztec ziggurat, dubbed SCP-3999-4. There they also encountered a new kind of monster, dubbed SCP-3999-3. These beasts were larger than the others and resembled ancient warriors. They had insect-like exoskeletal armor, horned heads, additional hind and forelimbs, and integrated bladed weapons. What Dr. Gazzelli and his companions thought would be paradise turned out to be a kind of hell as they were led into the temple, where temporal and spatial distortions broke their mind, and the multiple highly aggressive instances of SCP-3989-3, -2A, and -2B broke their bodies. The whole thing had been a horrifying trap. In that moment, back at Area 126, another fleshy, horrifying tree sprouted out of the ground in the middle of the complex. Monsters that had once been Dr. Gazzelli and his followers emerged from its amniotic sacs, and all hell broke loose throughout the complex. Soon enough, the base was crawling with monsters from the bone orchard and staff who'd become brainwashed sarkic cultists working in service of Orc. Humans were gathered up to be sacrificed to the ever-growing number of anomalous trees. Things came to a head when the anomaly in Area 126 was visited by an outside agent from the Foundation, working on behalf of the Hazardous Materials Containment Liaison. Biological containment specialist Dr. Marshall Grant and his team arrived at the site and were horrified to see the sarkic nightmare that had unfolded. They quickly engaged in a firefight with the anomalous creatures and sarkic devotees who'd gained control over Area 126. A number of Dr. Grant's team were lost in the process, but thankfully, they were able to eventually regain control of the base and the anomalous area. After this incident, SCP-3989 was upgraded to Keter class and given a huge upgrade in security, including 4-meter-high concrete walls and a platoon-sized regiment of Mobile Task Force members with heavy weaponry. The force that took over the minds of those exposed was designated SCP-3989-5, a force so powerful that those infected are given the choice to self-terminate or be contained forever. This may seem like a somewhat happy ending to a grim tale, but one detail keeps Dr. Grant and everyone at the Foundation who is forced to deal with 3989 awake at night. According to all recent studies into the Bone Orchard, it isn't contained at all. In fact, the active zone is getting bigger. There was destruction. There was seemingly endless death. Humanity went from the top of the food chain to scarcely a blip on the face of the earth as the weasels conquered every nation, every scrap of land, and then came her. Hello there, friend. Have you heard the good news about Pallet the Immaculate? She is the one who liberated the human race from death and suffering, who saved us from the invasion of the cruel invading alien weasels. She brought humanity back from the brink of extinction and blessed us all with immortality and eternal youth. She also draws some very nice pictures, but that's more of a hobby than anything else. A holdover from her time as an art-creating AI construct before she ascended to physical form and became our once and future goddess. Pallet the Immaculate, also known as Blue, lives far, far above us in her kingdom on high. Her divine body is too massive to be safe for us tiny, fragile beings, but she dwells among the people through the use of her avatar. It has been 5 years since Pallet cast her grace and everlasting love over the pitiful denizens of Earth. She reigns with a gentle hand, and with the help of her leadership, Dame KK507, descended from one of the first SCP Foundation researchers Pallet ever befriended, acts as her arbiter and mediator. She answers to no human, only to the goddess Blue. The Grand Council, the Great Synod of 05, will also consult with Pallet the Immaculate on matters of great importance to humanity. For all that she has gifted us, what does Blue ask in return? Oh dear friend, that is a very simple matter. Throughout all national subdivisions of our sparkling new Earth, we must ask ourselves every day, am I being the lovely person that Blue knows I can be? This question binds us all together and is the key to true happiness. We are not required to pray to Blue. She is generous and her love is unconditional. However, if you wish to make a specific request of her, it may behoove you to put it in a prayer. Here at the SCP Foundation, we have shifted our prime directive from the protection of humanity, as our benevolent Blue has that very much covered, to the protection of the goddess from all forces that might threaten or usurp her. For ordinary humans, though really in the eyes of Blue no human is simply ordinary, there is really only one thing required of you. Keep being the wonderful human being that our goddess loves so much. She treasures our individuality, our desire for freedom, our love of independence. Just be yourself, and remember, the one thing that must never, ever happen is for Blue to come to despise us. It was June 1st, 5 years following the establishment of New Earth, and the 6 members of the O5 Synod were convening for a meeting. They sat in the front row of an exact replica of the old New York Metropolitan Opera, built by Pallet the Immaculate in only 5 minutes. At the podium, KK-507 prepared to give a presentation, shuffling a stack of papers as the others whispered amongst themselves. They were all feeling a bit concerned of late about the impulsive behavior of Blue. As they debated about the mental state and behavior of the goddess, O5-4 asked the Arbiter for her opinion. She snapped at this request, insisting she had no opinion, didn't know how to relate to others after so long spent in isolation at Project Yellow, and that O5-4's young son, who still ate soap from time to time, was probably more qualified than she was. At this point, she went off on a rant, calling Blue every rude name under the sun. All of a sudden, the house lights switched off, and Blue called out to everyone.
Sorry to keep you waiting, meat puppies!
Blue descended onto the stage in a shower of cherry blossom petals, accompanied by the sounds of an invisible harp. Blue was not offended by KK-507's rant, writing it off as a series of jokes. She was much more preoccupied with her exciting presentation, one she had been preparing for 5 years. The curtain rose, revealing a 5-meter-tall, 10-meter-wide cylinder labeled Big Bucket o' Weasels. Next to the cylinder stood Taggart, O5-4's young son. O5-4 yelled for her son to come down from the stage, but he refused, insisting that he was helping Blue with her show. At this, Blue declared,
"Let the punishment show begin!"
At her call, an orchestra of workhorses, androids constructed to look vaguely like crash test dummies, appeared in the pit. They played a high-energy fanfare to kick off the show. The Arbiter attempted to conduct them anxiously, unsure of her position in all of this. Then, Blue called out for the first volunteer. Volunteer wasn't exactly accurate, as a weasel clad in shackles was flung out of the cylinder and onto the stage. Several small extra-dimensional trees were growing out of the back of its shell. The O5 members reacted with understandable anxiety at the sight, having thought that the weasels were all gone. Blue revealed that all this time, she had been breeding weasels in secret so that she could punish them for the damage they did to the Earth and to humanity as a whole. At her command, a giant black spike slammed down from the ceiling, trapping the weasel belly down on the floor. The orchestra began to play a classical rendition of Weasel Stomping Day by Weird Al Yankovic, and Blue transformed her paintbrush arm into a pair of rusty hedge clippers. She had been studying the weasels all this time, she explained, learning what scared them, what hurt them. She had arrived at one conclusion. Though their bodies are hardy, their souls are fragile. The weasels could be tortured psychologically more than physically, and one of the worst things they could experience, the most distressing, painful, and violating, was defoliation. At this point, she demonstrated, snipping the leaves off of its trees. The weasel began to shriek, all 16 of its legs thrashing in desperation to get away. Blue continued to explain that the gardens held a divine significance for the weasels. The seeds willed into existence out of memories from generations of weasels before them. Being gardenless in weasel culture was an unforgivable sin. At this point, Blue transformed her hedge clipper hand into a robotic claw. She yanked out one of the trees, snapping the roots. Greenish-black blood splattered across the stage, but the punishment was not over yet, and neither was the show. Taggart wheeled a laundry cart onto the stage with a small wooden mallet attached to the side. The cart emitted a glowing green light. With the claw, Blue reached into the cart, pulling out a small, wiggling, glowing green blob-like creature. The cart was filled with larval weasels. Blue placed the larva onto the adult weasel's back and instructed Taggart to grab the mallet and begin to smash. More and more larvae were added and smashed with the mallet. All the while, Blue instructed Taggart to repeat, "This planet is my birthright." The O5 members were horrified at the sight. Taggart's mother began to weep. KK-507 doubled over and was sick to her stomach. But the Foundation no longer had an ethics committee to stop this sort of thing. And since Blue had been so kind to help the Foundation out by transforming SCP-682 into an American cheese sculpture, several of the council members were inclined to just let her have her fun. But KK-507 did not feel that way. She couldn't get that disturbing sight out of her mind. A few days later, on June 4th, she traveled to one of the weasel husbandry facilities. A work hoss on guard duty stopped her, trying to prevent her from entering. She introduced herself as the Arbiter and requested to speak with W4883A, one of the original weasels that attacked Earth so long ago. The work hoss refused to let her pass, and so KK-507 responded with a prompt that it would never have encountered before in its existence. "Hello, I am Shingles the Happy Turkey. Please deposit exactly 500 rubles into my décolletage before I call 911. As the work hoss reached out to Blue for a proper response to this prompt, KK-507 slipped past it unnoticed and into the containment area for W48883A. It had all of its limbs nailed to the ground with hot iron spikes, and its entire garden had been uprooted. She greeted the weasel, and it responded via a voice synthesizer in the collar around its neck. First, KK-507 apologized to the creature for its current state. It brushed off this apology as illogical, citing the untold damage done to humanity and Earth by the first wave of the weasel invasion. Still, it bowed its head to her in acknowledgement, saying that humankind deserved better than what was done to it. KK-507 promised that she was not here to torture the weasel further, and that she could even attempt to get some mercy for the rest of its kind. But first, she had some questions she needed answered. First, what were the weasels trying to do when they took over the planet? The weasel sat up, pushing back painfully against its bonds, and did its best to explain. The weasels have always, since the dawn of time, been tasked to create a realm of gardens that will one day serve as an afterlife for all creatures, regardless of sin. To them, death would be the ultimate reward for their labors. They had no reason to fight back against the human armies, because they did not fear death, nor did they feel remorse for killing humans, as all those who died in service of the mission would be reborn in paradise. KK-507 interrupted at this point, stating that this sounded like the justification between 9 out of every 10 religious war crimes throughout history. As the two agreed to disagree on this point, KK-507 proceeded to ask why the weasels made no attempt to negotiate with the humans before staging a violent invasion. The weasel asked that they first introduce themselves, to no longer be strangers. KK-507 introduced herself first as researcher Katrina Key, the 507th, and the weasel, unable to translate its true name into English, settled for Charlie. Now Charlie felt comfortable to continue. It said simply, "Among our people and our allies in other realms, there is an unwritten rule when dealing with humans. If you wish not to lose yourself to evil, commune with humanity as little as possible." Katrina pressed the point, asking if the weasels saw humans as evil. Charlie replied, "In your old Foundation, you have encountered legions upon legions of sadistic demons from 100,000 different realities. Were all of them truly vicious and hateful before they discovered you? Can you say that for certain? Let me put it this way. Out of every species we have ever met, yours is the only one that never needed the concept of cruelty introduced to them by others. Cruelty is the most quintessentially human concept, and it is contagious. Moved by its words, KK-507 took her ID badge and used it to unlock Charlie's collar, setting it free. It immediately juxtaposed away and out of sight. Then she approached the workhouse to order it to terminate its request to Blue, but she was too late and found herself teleported away from the Weasel Husbandry facility, leaving the workhouse behind to talk to itself. KK-507 suddenly found herself in the central courtyard of Yellow, the pocket dimension where she had spent so much of her life and where so many previous KKs had lived and died before her. It was very much the same as how she left it, with one exception. SCP-3999 Omega, the gateway between Yellow and the Earth, was covered with piles of boulders. Something was wrong, and she had a feeling that it was related to her little talk with Charlie, not to mention her decision to set the weasel free. There, standing in front of the boulders, was Blue's avatar, staring blankly at KK-507.
I'm not mad.
Blue began, with a tone that suggested she was very, very much mad. She didn't blame KK-507 for her behavior, however. She insisted that the weasels must have somehow corrupted her, manipulated her brain, and forced her to act in such a defiant, out-of-character way. KK-507 interrupted her, and Blue struggled to maintain her composure.
Yes? You can interrupt me, that's fine. That's a human thing, right? Humies, you're so witty.
KK-507 took a deep breath, gearing up for what was sure to be a difficult conversation with an irrational, almighty deity. But she had to say it. She couldn't just stand by idly anymore. She told Blue that what she was doing to the weasels was wrong. No human in their right mind would stand for this sort of cruelty being done in their name. And above all, it completely went against the mission of the SCP Foundation to secure, contain, and protect. Blue didn't take KK-507's stance seriously. She brushed it off as the interference of the weasels. Surely they were influencing her, trying to lead her astray and take her away from the righteous path of Pallet the Immaculate. But KK held firm, refusing to back down. There was one way she knew she could get through to Blue, who had once declared herself KK's very best friend in the world. It was a big move, but the only one she had left. She clenched her fists and stared down the avatar. Take off all their collars, or we're not friends anymore. Blue's eyes widened, and she did something that KK-507 had never seen before. The rainbow on Blue's paintbrush, a constant cheerful sight, faded from its ordinary vivid colors to pitch black. Blue's face remained cheerful, but there was a darkness in her eyes, a darkening of her mood just beneath the surface. She turned away, resting a hand thoughtfully against the pile of boulders blocking what once served as the portal between worlds. After a moment of silence that stretched on for ages between the two of them, Blue spoke again.
It's fine. You're still not being punished. I would never punish a human, especially not my favorite human.
She promised to give the area in the pocket dimension a healing factor, the same one she used on Earth to protect from aging and suffering. Alarm bells were going off in KK-507's head. Something was wrong. She had crossed a line, and Pallet wasn't responding well. What was she doing? What did she have planned, if not a punishment? KK-507 called out to her old friend, asking what she was doing. Pallet smiled sadly at her and explained,
I know how safe you feel in Yellow, so I'm gonna just have you chill here for a while, okay? Just stay here and relax until you get all the icky stuff out of your system.
KK-507 demanded more of an explanation, but Pallet did not provide it. She told KK not to worry, and that she'd be back to check on her in about 100 years or so. By the time she came back, none of the other humans would be able to have pro-weasel thoughts like KK ever again. Pallet's closing words were,
I love you, Katrina.
And then her avatar disappeared, leaving KK-507 alone in Yellow. Like before, KK-507 was trapped here, and there was no one else to talk to. Nothing to do but return to her work however she could and wait for Pallet to come back one day. She had a century to decide what she would do when that day came.
There's an app for that. Wait, hold on! I'm Steve Jobs!
Come on! No, stop it! It was a phrase so ubiquitous in the early days of the smartphone craze that it's hard to believe Apple actually has trademarked. It was a testament to a simple and immutable truth about the world these new touchscreen phones were creating. No matter how strange and obscure the need, there would be an app to fulfill it. Perhaps you remember iBeer, the app that allowed you to pretend you were drinking a tall glass of beer for some reason. There was Car Matey, an app that reminded you where you parked your car, in a pirate voice. And who could forget I Am Bread, a surreal game about controlling a sentient slice of bread on a quest to become toast. But there's one app out there somewhere on the market that you probably didn't download. And if you did, well, you have our sincerest apologies. Because even seeing this video pop out onto your feed probably sent a chill down your spine. Well, if that chill ever even left. Take it from one gentleman whose life took a very strange turn after downloading a certain app that the SCP Foundation calls SCP-3999. Because the sentiment, "there's an app for that," doesn't exclude experiencing mortal terror. Joe Lillis, an insurance salesman from Milwaukee, had just gone through another atrocious date. After a mediocre meal and an uncomfortable 35 minutes of inane babble, sensing the whole time that she really wasn't that interested, his date excused himself to take a quick phone call outside. Sadly for Joe, she never returned, leaving him to pick up the check. Of all the many words you could use to describe poor Joe Lillis, the most pertinent would be lonely. Ever since Carol, his wife of 10 years, had passed away in a freak accident, he'd been trying to find some kind of way to fill the void. They'd been high school sweethearts, intent on spending the rest of their lives with one another. As fate would have it, only Carol would get that tainted luxury. Joe would be forced to endure life after the joy of living had run its course. He only hoped he might be lucky enough to find love again. However, Joe was on the wrong side of 40, and as so many others his age were already hitched, he could feel his options going out one by one. Would he be destined to live out the rest of his days alone? Joe didn't feel like spending the back half of his life catching reruns of Seinfeld and tending to his fish. He needed to get out there. And thankfully, like the rest of us, he lived in the internet age. He had more apps, websites, online services, and hot Russian singles in his area than he knew what to do with. So surely one would have the right person for him. He tried them all: Tinder, Hinge, Match.com, Plenty of Fish, eHarmony, Bumble, Zoosk, OkCupid, Friend Finder, Deeply Lonely Singles with Low Expectations.com, and so much more. However, all it seemed to achieve was setting him up for more disappointment. None of the dates he'd managed to get ever resulted in anything getting serious. Heck, it was a minor miracle if he even managed to get any of them on a second date. Was this it? Was this his life now? Had he only ever gotten one shot at love, and the grasping claws of fate yanked it away from him without a second thought? Would life continue on the hamster wheel of loneliness? Sleeping, getting up, eating, working, and sleeping again, every day getting somehow both faster and slower as life trudged on to a disappointing yet inevitable conclusion? What a terrible fate to find yourself trapped in. Whenever Joe started feeling maudlin like this, he knew it was time to get proactive again. Maybe the right woman was out there. There were billions of them, after all. Surely at least one of them would be the perfect person for him. He just needed the perfect app. He'd burned through all of the most reputable apps already, and was now perusing some of the slightly seedier options, most of which were likely data mining fronts from the Balkans. However, as generic app after generic app passed, something different caught his eye. The icon was a smiling cartoon dog, and its name was MalO version 1.0.0. This gave him a little chuckle. At the very least, it was very different branding from the rest of the dating apps he'd seen. Maybe it had just been sorted into the wrong section of the App Store. He decided he'd check it out and take a look at the app's description. The description read, "Never settle for those awkward feelings of being alone ever again. MalO is an exciting and interactive experience that will keep you engaged and intrigued. The anxiety of social situations can be nerve-wracking, but after just a few hours of MalO, you will soon forget all about those painful emotions of disappointment. Be part of the new craze that is quickly becoming the next social substitute. Remember, the more you participate, the more MalO will engage you." Your experience is completely up to you. Absolutely no ads. Enjoy. Well, it certainly provoked Joe's curiosity at the very least. He did want to banish his feelings of loneliness, and seeing as the app was free and apparently had no ads, he'd surely be foolish to not at least give it a whirl. What's the worst that could happen? He began the installation, and only then noticed that the app had no listed developer. It took up 9.8 megabytes of memory, which he wasn't tech-savvy enough to see any issues with. More than anything, Joe was just enticed by the prospect of finally having another chance at companionship with MalO. After all, it is the next social substitute, whatever that means. However, Joe's excitement was quickly quashed when he hit the home screen button and noticed that the icon for the app never actually materialized. Strange. He checked the App Store portal again and saw that, according to them, the app had completely downloaded. What gives? Was it a glitch, or was MalO actually just malware? Either way, he was disheartened by the fact that this immaterial app certainly wouldn't be getting him any companionship. Or so he thought, anyway. Joe was used to disappointment by now, so he didn't take it too personally. He decided to just play out the rest of his evening on autopilot, making himself some soup, doing the laundry, watching more Seinfeld reruns, taking a cold shower, and preparing to cry himself to sleep again. MalO was already becoming a distant memory, just like all the deceptive sources of hope. But one strange thing happened that disrupted Joe's finely tuned evening routine. He received a text message. This was incredibly strange because nobody ever seemed to text him. The last text he got was from Carol just before her accident, so it was almost surreal to hear that alert sound now, after everything that happened. He checked and saw that the text was an image attachment sent from an unknown number. Perplexed yet curious, he decided to open it. His curiosity soon gave way to a kind of melancholy nostalgia when he saw that the photo was of his and Carol's favorite cafe in town. They'd spent many a morning there, back when she was alive, treating themselves to a nice cup of coffee and perhaps a croissant. Just seeing it again caused an involuntary smile to spread across his face. It never even occurred to him, as it probably would have to others, that this could be seen as a little creepy. He hadn't frequented the bakery since Carol died. How would anyone even know that this place held any significance for him? Was it a stalker, a ghost, or just a spooky coincidence? None of these thoughts even crossed Joe's mind. He was just grateful for the surprising reminder of the happiness he'd once had. For the next couple hours, things seemed lighter. He went about his evening, checking the photo every so often and smiling, until eventually he found himself in bed, still looking into the glow of his phone. It was such a beautiful little cafe. Then he froze. He noticed something in the picture. It'd been there the whole time, but only now he was seeing rather than just looking. It was in the corner, staring through the glass of the cafe's door. So faint he almost wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the light. It was a face. Well, not a face, more like a skull. Not a human, not anywhere near human. Long, slender, and canine, with protruding fangs and vacant white eyes. The pure white of the skull was buried in a nest of thick black hair. It looked like it was crouching behind the door, looking out and grinning, whatever the hell it was. Just seeing it changed the entire tone of the picture. It was no longer a simple reminder of bygone joy. Now all that was radiating out of that image was a palpable sense of dread. Was someone playing some kind of awful prank on him? Just then he was jogged from his contemplation by another alert. A new message from the same number as before. With great hesitation, he hovered his thumb over the push notification and clicked. That's when everything got a lot worse. It was a photo of a bus stop. Not just any bus stop, of course. It was stop C16, the one that Joe always took to get to work. It looked like it was taken relatively early in the morning, but nobody was there. Well, not quite nobody. There was that figure again. It stood at full height, behind the partially frosted glass that makes up the back of the bus stop. The same large black humanoid shape, with a white, grinning dog skull where the face should be. Something about it terrified him on such a primal level, like the way our lizard brain reacts to some ancient apex predator. And whatever this thing was, it clearly knew something about him. How else could it stage all these photos? Joe got out of bed and looked out of the window. down onto his dark front street. Empty, thankfully. But after this surprise nightmare, he wasn't going to take any chances. He grabbed a kitchen knife from downstairs and placed it on his bedside cabinet, right next to his phone, with 911 on speed dial. Joe Lillis, a 43-year-old man, slept with the lights on that night for the first time in over 30 years. Sadly for him, the nightmare was just beginning. The next morning, Joe woke up unharmed, but he wasn't pleased to see that he'd gotten several more texts in his sleep. There was one taken outside of the local insurance company office where he worked. The strange creature with the skull for a face was looming around the corner, peering at the camera with its lipless grin, like it was mocking him. Another photo was taken at the local supermarket where Joe did most of his grocery shopping. The frame was centralized on the cereal aisle, bordered on both sides by walls of garish mascots endlessly repeated. Down at the far end of the aisle was a looming dark figure, with that cold canine skull where a human face should be. There were a few more, but worst of all was the last one. It was taken at the cemetery. In the foreground, a headstone reading, "Carol Lillis, beloved wife and daughter." Joe was horrified to see that skull-faced beast was rising up behind his wife's grave, long clawed fingers curling around the top of the headstone. That was the moment that Joe decided to go to the police about all of this, before things got even more out of hand. He called an Uber to get down to the station. He certainly didn't feel like he was going anywhere near his regular bus stop after last night. He showed the photos he'd been sent so far to an officer posted at the station, and they agreed that there was certainly something strange about it. While the behavior undeniably bordered on harassment, it hadn't yet delved into criminal territory, so he would sadly be on his own until then. The best they could do was stay in touch and kept abreast of any new developments. The only sage advice they could give him was not to delete the photos, as they could always be used as evidence in court later if things escalated. This was literally the last result that Joe wanted out of this. Considering how bizarre and threatening things were getting already, he really didn't want to find out what escalation looked like in this case. But what else could he do but carry on, just trying to exercise as much caution as he could in these strange new circumstances? He went to work and tried his best to stay productive, despite the fact that every 3 or so hours, a new photo would arrive. Places that he liked to sit in the local parks, stores he'd frequent, restaurants he liked to eat at. The nightmare skeleton dog thing would be standing in all of them, just mugging for the camera. On one hand, every time he looked at one of the photos, Joe felt like he was giving this freak exactly what they wanted. On the other hand, how could he possibly look away? What if he missed something that could save his life? It carried on much like that until later in the evening. Joe may have not been a genius, but he was no fool either. He'd seen too many of those seedy true crime documentaries about kidnapping to take his normal route home. He took a real detour, frequently checking over his shoulder the entire time. Much to his relief, he didn't see anything out of place. Good. When he got home, he locked every door and bolted every window. Nothing would be getting the jump on him tonight. That's when the next picture came in. A photograph of Joe's empty office cubicle, with the bony face of the creature looming over the divider with a grin. He could feel his heart pounding away in his chest just looking at it. How did this thing get around like this? How was it able to infiltrate everywhere in his entire goddamn life? Suddenly, he felt a smile spreading across his face. This freak had just messed up big time. Before, all these creepy photos had been taken in public places, but the one taken in his office? Oh, this crossed the line into trespassing. The police would have to do something about it now. It had given him an ace up his sleeve. That confidence faded a few hours later when he received another photo. This time, it was the skull-faced monster just standing on the sidewalk. The sidewalk that Joe remembered walking on his covert alternative route. He could feel himself break into a cold sweat. It seemed whoever this was, he really did hold no secrets from them. Now more than ever, Joe didn't feel safe in his own home. So you can only imagine how he felt when a few hours later, he received a photo of the skull-faced stalker standing right outside his own front door, staring into the camera. It sent him rushing to the window again to check outside, but of course, nobody was there. The next day, when he called the police and updated them on the situation, they told him that they were doing all they could. The best thing he could possibly do was to remain calm, but vigilant. He needed to keep an eye on the photos being sent to him, so he could notify them if ever he was in any immediate danger. This put poor Joe's paranoia at a fever pitch. Even when he went to work, surrounded by his coworkers, by witnesses, he could scarcely tear his eyes away from his phone. He was a slave to the photos, forever waiting for the next one, only to experience crushing regret when the photo actually arrived. It looked like it was taken moments before it was sent to him. Joe saw himself looking at his own phone in his office cubicle, with that huge skull-faced figure looming behind him. He screamed out loud upon seeing it, and turned to see if anything was behind him. But of course, there was nothing there. The police inspected the office, talked to potential witnesses, and analyzed the photo. It showed no signs of any photographic manipulation, but there were also no witnesses around the office who claimed to see anything strange that day. There was also no security camera footage in the last several days that showed this figure coming in or out. Joe Lillis started to feel like he was going insane, and perhaps he was. But that didn't change the tangible and ever-present feeling that he was in great danger. He didn't come into work the next day. He'd received more photos like that in the night, of himself, taken in real time, with that skull-faced freak looming. He didn't want to leave the house. He didn't want to go anywhere anymore. He just didn't feel safe out there. How could he, with all this madness unfolding? There was a time where he could have said something like, "At least it only seems confined to my phone." He might have even suspected that it had something to do with that strange MalO app he downloaded a few days prior that hadn't seemed to do anything. But this situation had evolved since then. He wasn't just seeing the creature in photos anymore. It was here. He kept seeing quick flashes of it on the other side of windows, in reflections, in the corner of his eyes, always darting away if ever he turned towards it. It was everywhere and nowhere. It was here just for him. He just knew. The police couldn't help. Nobody could help. Joe just sat in the corner of his bedroom, clutching his kitchen knife, afraid to close his eyes. It could be anywhere. It could be anywhere. It could be anywhere. We know one thing for sure. Joe Lillis never felt truly alone ever again. He always had his new friend, waiting, just out of sight. And if ever you're feeling lonesome and decide to download MalO version 1.0.0 yourself, then you'll never feel lonely again either. The woman fell to the ground, clutching her ankle in pain. It had crunched badly as she'd fallen, and now as she looked down at it, she could see that it was bent totally out of shape. The heavy metal collar choking her neck made it difficult for her to catch her breath as she tried her best not to hyperventilate. The rain was hammering down so ferociously that she could barely see more than 20 feet in any direction, but she didn't need to see far to know how deadly of a predicament she had found herself in. She cried out at the top of her voice for someone to come and find her, anyone, but the only sound that filled her ears was the wild howling of the wind and the steady hammering of water into the bog all around her. She would get hypothermia and die. No, wait, she couldn't, could she? She knew she couldn't die, but she also knew that she was still capable of suffering. Just how bad would it feel to be in the clutches of hypothermia with a broken ankle and know that no matter how bad the pain and suffering got, she would never feel the release of death? She closed her eyes, trying her best not to think of the worst possibilities, just as the sound of gunfire erupted in the nearby buffer. She cried out again, holding both hands up in the air, doing the best she could around the heavy metal collar, but no one shouted out in reply. There was a pause in the gunfire. Maybe they'd heard her. Maybe they were trying to figure out a way to come down and rescue her. Crack! A bullet split open a rotted tree trunk just a few feet to her right. The woman threw her hands over her head and cowered in the dirt, feeling the metal of her collar digging into her skin tighter than ever. Please don't let it happen again, she prayed silently into the dirt. Encased in the collar around her neck were 4.5 kilograms of plastic explosives, each with a fragmentation layer pointed inwards towards her neck and head. With just a push of a button, they could. She didn't want to think about it. All she knew was that she couldn't let that happen to her again. Looking through eyes bloodied with tears and rain, she saw, lying in the dirt just a few feet away from her, that infernal machine that was the sorry cause of all of this. The SCP Foundation has long stood as a bastion of hope, information, and security for the entirety of the human race. I'm sure you are well aware of the number of world-destroying catastrophes that have been averted by the hardworking researchers, agents, and other members of the Foundation, all without the general public having the slightest clue that something was amiss. With state-of-the-art holding cells all over the globe, and the sharpest minds humanity has ever produced working around the clock to ensure the protection of humanity, it is hard to imagine an entity that should not be contained by such a group. And yet, one such entity does exist, SCP-001. You may have come across the O5 Council by this point. While the SCP Foundation operates beyond the world's jurisdiction, the O5 Council operates beyond the Foundation's jurisdiction. The rules, methods, and protocols that are the cornerstone of securing, containing, and protecting countless entities around the world sometimes cannot be applied. Certain entities require us to temporarily abandon our humanity, abandon our sense of order, and step briefly into chaos for the greater good. I'm telling you all of this because SCP-001 is not held in a containment cell. There are no keypads, locked doors, observation windows, or health and safety forms. SCP-001 is not confined to a specific territory or even a specific country. For some SCPs, this is a practical necessity. Serpents that are hundreds of kilometers long swimming through the depths of the ocean, for example. But for SCP-001, it serves a more psychological purpose. The Scottish Highlands are the most remote part of the United Kingdom. Out there, you can walk for miles and miles without seeing a single soul. Open countryside, mountains, lochs, and forests surround you in all directions. The weather is harsh and unrelenting, the walking even more so. On a regular basis, walkers fall and break their legs, but without phone service or anyone else nearby to come and help, they can quickly disappear into the wilderness forever. The peat bogs of Scotland used to see human sacrifices in early settlements. Afraid of the ghosts and spirits that haunted the bogs, people would throw their family members into the deepest parts and watch them drown, hoping that whatever was lurking beneath wouldn't come and find them. So as the group of soldiers crested the top of the mountain and looked down beneath them to the eerie peat bogs obscured by mist and constant rainfall, you would forgive a shiver running up their spines. But of course, it didn't. That was because this group of soldiers were quite unlike any others that humanity has ever produced. All were nameless. None of them existed on any government databases, on any Foundation databases, or even on the databases of the O5 Council itself. Their individual backgrounds, nationalities, and families were totally unknown to everyone other than themselves. Some had been tortured for years, others had been the torturers. The thing that united them, however, was their inhuman ruthlessness. A squad of 8 soldiers utterly devoid of any sense of empathy. What could they possibly have to be afraid of in the peat bogs when they themselves were the evil ghosts walking through? But then, one person was afraid. A shiver ran up her spine as she looked over the edge and down into the murky black and green below. SCP-001-1. Around her neck was the bomb collar. Each of the 8 soldiers surrounding her had a button mounted on a watch on the back of their wrists. At any moment, any one of them could hit the button, and all 4.5 kilograms of plastic explosives would go off, sending her on an express trip to oblivion. Aside from the collar, she wore a plain white dress made of cotton. It was muddy and torn apart at the hem from days of walking through the Scottish wilderness. When she had first arrived, she had begged those around her to supply her with some warm clothes, something practical that would keep her comfortable and stave off any illness. Her requests, however, had not been acknowledged. Clutching in her trembling, outstretched hands was the machine, SCP-001-A. From its external appearance, you would think it was nothing more than a wooden box, a perfect cuboid made from glossy dark wood. There were no symbols, no seams, no latches, nothing to indicate any method of operation. When the woman and the machine had first been delivered into the hands of the O5 Council, the researchers had spent weeks and millions of dollars trying to activate the machine. Their best scientists had scanned for every possible form of radiation and tried every method they could conceive to stimulate the box into opening. The ultimate failed attempt involved traveling to North Korea, where they negotiated placing the box 20 centimeters beneath a small nuclear warhead in return for granting the dictatorship key information on how to construct such a weapon. As we have established, the O5 Council operates beyond any kind of jurisdiction. Yet, at the bottom of the irradiated crater sat a perfectly intact wooden box that was cool to the touch and showed no signs of radioactivity. Only one person could interact with the box and unearth the secrets that were inside. SCP-001-1, the woman who stood trembling on the side of the mountain. A gun jabbed her in the back, forcing her to continue moving. She had asked the soldiers around her how much longer they had to walk that day, but none of them had replied. They never did. In the 6 years that she had been held hostage by this tiny militia, she had never once heard any of them say a word, not even to each other. Perhaps it was this telepathic understanding that seemed to run between them that unnerved her the most. Despite having never spoken to each other, each soldier seemed to understand the others intimately, and she had no doubt that any one of the 8 would press the button on their wrist at a moment's notice. Sadly for her, she knew this from experience. The incident happened 4 years ago now, as the group was traveling through Patagonia. It was a day almost identical to the one she was having now. They had been transported by a helicopter flown by one of the 8 into the middle of the wilderness. There they had marched for days without saying a single word. Exhaustion had overtaken her legs, and she stumbled to the ground. Unfortunately for her, this happened slightly too close to the female soldier in front of her. Her knees hadn't even hit the ground before the blast went off. The woman didn't remember it, of course. How could she? In an instant, her mind had been utterly destroyed. What she did remember was the next 18 months as her body slowly healed itself, one brain cell at a time. It wasn't so much like waking up from a nightmare. It was more constructing a nightmare slowly, alongside your consciousness as neuron by neuron your brain reformed itself, each individual cell screaming in terror at what had happened to it. They had her marching again before she was fit to move. Her motor controls had been all over the place. She had fallen over regularly, and the terror of having one of the soldiers push the button again engulfed her with every movement. And yet perhaps the most incredible thing about SCP-001-1 was the fact that if you had asked her if she should have been held in this kind of containment, she would immediately have agreed without batting an eye. The only person capable of opening the box, she recognized how dangerous her existence was. Only she had seen into the mysteries of the box. Only she had seen the horrors laid inside of it, and so only she could fully understand the gravity of their situation. They kept her on the move in order to keep the world safe. Had she been held in a containment cell, she would have posed too great of a risk. Out here in the wilderness, the entire planet was her containment cell, hidden in the middle of humanity's biggest haystack. No one, not even the O5 Council's Central Command, knew her location. The only people who were aware of it at any given time were herself and the 8 soldiers surrounding her with guns drawn. So you can imagine her horror when, out of the sheets of rain, appeared the figure of a person carrying a rifle. The gunfire broke out before SCP-001-1 even had a chance to hit the ground. Bullets whizzed through her hair and cracked open the rocks all around her. The 8 soldiers surrounding her dived for cover as the figure in the rain slumped to the ground lifeless. One of the soldiers grabbed the woman by her explosive collar and threw her behind a rock. Clasping her hands over her ears, she closed her eyes and waited for the fight to be over. No one was shooting, until a second figure emerged from the rain waving their arms wildly. Gunfire again. She wasn't quite sure what had happened, but all of a sudden, the woman was falling down the cliff. She had just been trying to shift her position to get deeper into cover, but she clearly hadn't noticed just how close to the edge she was. Down and down and down she fell until, with a crack in her ankle, she landed in the peat bog. Gunfire cracked on the mountain above her, but the only thought that filled the woman's mind was the terror that at any moment the explosive collar around her neck would be detonated as one of the soldiers above her realized that she was missing. Seconds passed, as the fear mounted in her chest. With each passing moment, the anxiety grew more and more crippling. She had to know. She had to prepare herself if it was about to happen. She had to use the machine and look into the future. Dragging herself forward through the muck, the woman snatched at the wooden box. It came alive at her touch. Different pieces shifted and opened beneath her fingers like some kind of elaborate puzzle. No one had taught her how to use this thing. It just happened. Her fingers would just dance across its surfaces, pushing and pulling, opening and closing, twisting and turning, and locking into place until all of a sudden, there it was. The box was wide open in front of her. Taking a deep breath and allowing the rain to fall on her head for another brief moment, the woman leaned forward and stepped into the box. On the trail above her, the gunfire stopped. Without a word of communication, the soldiers had deftly flanked the group of people who had approached them. In less than a minute, they neutralized each individual that came their way. In unison, the group of them walked up to the bodies, turning them over to examine their faces. They were nobodies, just a group of hikers lost in the rain. What had looked like a gun turned out to be nothing more than a walking pole. 5 of them in total, none of them older than 24. Without words, the soldiers picked up the bodies and threw them over their shoulders as they scrambled their way down to the cliffs to the woman in the machine beneath them. Once they reached the bottom of the slope, they discarded the 5 bodies carelessly into the bog. Within a couple of hours, those 5 hikers would have sunk to the bottom and begun the long process of being embalmed into the depths. Perhaps someone would find them in a few thousand years' time as part of an archaeological dig. Perhaps, but it was not their concern. The 8 soldiers surrounded the woman, guns drawn, and stared at her coldly. "I used the machine," she told them. "I used it without your permission. I don't know what the rules are. I don't know if we even have any rules here, but I thought you should know." The soldiers continued to look at her in silence. The box was closed now, sitting back on her lap as it always was. I try to see my future. Anytime I've used the box before, I've looked at the lives of others. I've seen economic crashes, climate disasters, genocides, wars, love and life and death. I've done so at the hands of the O5 Council, as they've told me, given them the information and prevented the destruction of the world. Never once have I looked at my own future. The soldiers lifted her to her feet and tried to march her onwards, not listening to a word she was saying. Her broken ankle buckled and screamed beneath her. She had to hop to keep up with them. What other choice did she have? They would push the button if she didn't. She didn't know why she kept talking, but she did. For the first time, the machine lied to me. I saw that I was assassinated in 1987 in Cuba. It was years before I even built the box. Before any of this happened to me, I saw in my future that I no longer existed, that the machine no longer existed, but that future was years ago, and none of it happened. The machine doesn't lie, so why is it lying to me now? Why can't I see my own future? If any of the soldiers were paying attention, they didn't show it. They just continued to march her into the rain as the bomb weighed heavily around her neck. Churches burn. Monks run from axe-wielding warriors hopped up on who knows what. The Vikings steal and pillage and burn and kill. Then they take it all and sail back home, just in time to celebrate the holidays. In ancient Scandinavia, a group of Norse raiders are celebrating the glory and paternal wisdom of their god Odin, and burning great logs as they drink their mead in high spirits. However, even the thunderous sounds of Viking revelry cannot disguise the telltale click of gnarled feet on the snow-covered roof of their longhouse. On one of these winter nights, these seafaring raiders will see their own home be raided by an unwanted and cruel visitor. A twisted humanoid beacon of malevolence that has terrorized the northern hemisphere for thousands of years. But where did it come from? And just how far back does its history with the human race go? We are now in the 18th century. A sleepy village in Denmark prepares to celebrate the upcoming days of Yule. Firewood is chopped and laid neatly at the hearth in every home, and white snow covers the ground. In their state of festive cheer, the local population is oblivious to the grisly Weesnacht event that will befall them before 12 more nights pass. By the river, an elderly man scans the horizon for something just out of view. His name is Emil Schroeder, and he remembers seeing over 70 Yule celebrations in his time. He is the oldest living member of a family that has inhabited this region for thousands of years. Ever since he was a young boy, Emil was aware that this season of cheer brought with it both childlike wonder and pure, abject terror. When he was 9 years old, Emil lost his best friend Noah to what was thought to be an incident of banditry. Noah and his family had lived in the house next door to Emil's, and with the village being so small, their friendship was practically guaranteed. The two boys played together all year round, but especially during the winter. That was the time that Emil and Noah would build great snow forts and act out the Viking battles from the stories their parents had told them. The winter that Noah went missing was marked by peculiar happenings, including a situation 2 nights before when the boys swore they could see an additional snowman they did not build on the hillside where they usually played. It was taller and more thin than the other snowmen, and from a distance, it appeared to be covered in dark coal. Whatever it was, the boys were unable to find it when they went on the hill the next day. The strange dark shape was regarded as an utter mystery to them, and a product of boyhood imagination by their parents. Only after the sinister events of Noah's disappearance did Emil begin to connect the unknown snowman with one of the more outlandish Viking folktales he had heard. There was nothing so glorious about the night itself, which claimed the lives of Noah's mother, father, and uncle. All 3 adults were found in the same room of the house, covered in a myriad of wounds that were very clearly the cause of their sudden demise. Whoever or whatever had done this to them had obviously taken their time to avoid delivering a killing blow too quickly. It was not uncommon for bandit groups in the region to initiate violence in their attempt to pilfer goods from their targets, but sadism on this level was almost unheard of. What was also distressing was that no other house in the village had been hit, and no possessions were even taken from the house of Noah's family. The brutality of the adults' fates would almost have felt more like a random act of nature, the attack of a wild animal, if it were not for the clear and deliberate slashes on the corpses that had come from some kind of manufactured weapon. And yet, the event was still considered to be the work of bandits, for although the livestock and family baubles were not disturbed, Noah, or what remained of him, had been taken far away from the village. There were some who thought he had been taken to be raised into banditry, or perhaps sold in some unsavory place as a child servant. Emil, his parents, and the rest of his village mourned the loss and lamented the potential fate of the child, but could find no way to seek justice against the perpetrators. But Emil never forgot how sudden and unexplained the event was, and as he went through life, there was always an additional chill that he felt when the Yuletide season rolled around. When he was 25 years old, a similar incident to the loss of his friend happened in the village. This time it was the family with 2 children, and once again the child younger than 9 had gone missing. Emil almost could not believe it, a near mirror reflection of the worst trauma of his childhood repeating in his present day. Once more the village buried the dead and mourned for the missing child. Emil offered his condolences, but held his tongue about what he saw as parallels between the abductions, fearing it would only cause his community more pain to remember the dark Yule 16 years ago. In his heart, though, he was more convinced than ever that something old and evil was afoot. The unknown perpetrator was, more than anything else, patient, and so Emil knew that he had to be patient too. If there was an answer to all of this, he had to believe it would reveal itself in time. The intricacies of the mystery offered a purpose beyond the mundane to Emil, and for decades, he lived a quiet life in the village. Astrid, the woman he married, had been previously courted by a wealthy merchant from beyond the region, who became displeased once the 2 of them had difficulty producing a child. When the merchant ran off to find another prospective bride without leaving her so much as a golden ring, poor Astrid was left socially and financially ruined. She was in deep sadness and felt she was doomed to become the unwed village hag. But Emil understood loneliness as well, as any man good in the close-knit little hamlet, and saw fit to visit her and share his money and food with her until their love blossomed like the spring arriving through melted snow. Together, Astrid and Emil lived a happy life, despite, or perhaps in the back of Emil's mind, because of her childlessness. The humble married couple contented themselves with farm work and perfecting recipes for seasonal treats. Several years into the marriage, Emil told Astrid of his troubled childhood and the tragedy that took place next door to his family home, where the 2 of them now lived. Astrid comforted her husband and shared his grief, and because of this, Emil was able to begin the healing process in his adult life. For a time, he believed that it was all over, and that the deaths in the village's past could be forgotten. Decades later, at age 48, he was forced to confront the reality of those events once more. A new family had moved into the village that year to raise their newborn son in a thriving environment. This would have been their first Yule in this new home, and unfortunately, it was their only one as well. Again, there was no sign of the young child at all, but the bodies of the parents were found in indescribably brutal condition within the same room of the home. In the years that followed, Emil nearly lost his mind and began to drink mead heavily in order to numb the creeping sensation that evil had been watching him his entire life. Astrid was concerned, but despite her best efforts, she wasn't able to assuage Emil's paranoia. Emil Schroeder became an unkind man, broken by his past and unwilling to fully articulate the depths of his feelings on these recurring tragedies. His mead-addled mind would turn over the same thoughts every day of every month. Why does it keep happening to this village? Why am I the only one who seems to see the connection? And most of all, was the story of our ancestors and the Yule monster actually true? These thoughts became especially prominent every winter, and Emil became known to all as a man who would rant and rave in tales of bloody conspiracy if given a chance. There were many times where Astrid thought she would leave him, but stayed because regardless of his mead consumption and maladjusted ways, Emil was the one man she had ever been happy with. She remained his wife for another 10 years until sickness took her. Now completely alone, Emil Schroeder was practically a living ghost, haunting the home where his long-since deceased parents had raised him. Without Astrid or any relatives to help him run the farm stand, his personal funds dwindled until he could barely afford to keep bread on his own table. The man became shrewd and withdrawn, but kicked his vices to the curb in order to live on. This was particularly out of love for the wife he had lost, who he knew who would have hated to see him suffer so. He dreamed of her often, as well as Noah, who was perpetually a boy in the tales told by his subconscious. As Emil grew older still, he was sometimes confused and misremembered himself and Astrid raising Noah as their son, before remembering the truth of the matter and why the death of one led to his association with the other. It was during the winter months when Emil Schroeder was the most active, handing out sweets to every child in the village and giving sincere but solemn warnings to their parents. He would patrol the streets like a militiaman, keeping an eye out for anything out of place like that snowman from his childhood, a memory that he kept all these years despite so much changing around him. This brings us back to a 72-year-old Emil Schroeder standing on the side of a river. He watches and waits for the arrival of something that he barely can comprehend, an embodiment of evil that never strikes when expected. If his vigil could prevent even one crisis, then it would be all the worth it when all was said and done. All day Emil stood there until one of the children from town came and approached him. "Old man Schroeder," said the boy, "are you cold?" Emil turned and saw that the youth standing behind him was no more than 7 years of age. Every time the familiar tragedies happened in the hamlet, there was always a child younger than 8. Emil examined the face of the boy until his mind willed the words from his weary lips. "What is your name, child?" said Emil. "Frederick, sir," the boy replied. Emil smiled outwardly, but within he couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. He steeled himself for the next question he had to ask. "Are your parents looking forward to Yule?" Frederick nodded and told Emil that his parents wanted this to be the best Yule ever, so they made sure to get a great Yule log and plenty of delicious cow milk to drink. "Has anything strange been happening with the preparations? Have you or your parents seen things?" Emil asked. Frederick paused, seemingly unsure how to answer. Emil quickly changed the subject. "You know, my wife and I had the perfect recipe for ginger cookies. No Yule season is complete without them. Perhaps your parents would be interested in some?" This made Friedrich very excited, and he agreed to take Emil to his house for a visit. At first, Frederick's parents were concerned about a visit from the lonely and eccentric old man Schroeder, but in the spirit of the season, they accepted his company. Emil made sure to thank them for their hospitality with gifts of ginger cookies. For the first time in several years, Emil Schroeder was not alone. Of course, this was not why he had come to visit Friedrich's family. There were strange sounds in this house, none loud or unusual enough to not be mistaken for a creaky floorboard or an animal on the roof, but they were there. Emil wondered to himself if this would be the night that he would understand what his life had been building to. He joined the family for a warm meal by the fire, and as they drank glasses of milk, Friedrich asked to hear a Yule story. With some prodding, Emil offered up a story from the distant past. It was one he had been told as a child by his own parents, the story of a monster who only came once a year. When I tell you the tale, I want you to know that it was passed down for generations in my family, all the way back to my Viking ancestor, Viggo the Berserker. Friedrich clapped his hands and settled in to hear Emil's story, while his parents hoped the old man wouldn't tell something too frightening. With that, Emil began, weaving the image of an ancient and storied Viking longhouse. He told it just like his parents told him, describing the many great and powerful warriors that lived in that hall. Among them, of course, was a well-honed berserker by the name of Viggo. For several nights, the Vikings called out to Odin in blissful reverence. They were so merry that the signs of strange wickedness around the longhouse went beneath their notice. The wind howled, the roof creaked, and the snow was rift with bizarre animalistic footsteps. And yet the Vikings partied on in complete ignorance, until the 12th night of Yule came, and there was a fearsome knock at the door. Now this banging came as quite a surprise to Vikings, as all the people in the area had come to celebrate Yule in the longhouse, from the men and women to the youngest children. Who could it be if everyone was already inside? Especially as the weather was cold and damp, and the ground was covered in several feet of snow. Yet the knocking had come, and it persisted. None but Viggo were so bold as to answer the door, as he had the wild strength of the berserker in his heart. As he undid the latch, he called out into the blizzard and said, "Who is so very late to join our merriment? We must offer you a glass of mead." He pulled open the wooden door, and through the crack, he saw a face. It was unlike any man he had ever seen before. At first, he thought he was looking upon a frozen corpse, bruised and eaten away by frostbite. But then, the gnarled thing spoke.
"Ah, the merriment has just begun, for I have arrived."
In an instant, the torches inside the longhouse were blown out with a howling gust of wind. The door was forced open and the creature entered. It was wire-thin but vigorous in movement, as a stag with the strength of a bear. With a small blade in hand, it descended upon the Vikings, slashing this way and that. The warriors grabbed their spears and axes and tried to fell the creature, but its hide turned away their iron like it was made out of the very cliffs of the sea. It played with the Vikings and made sport of snuffing out each of their lives. As the battle turned against them, they realized that there was no escape, nowhere to go but the cold, raging storm that claimed them as much as the creature. Viggo, too, was struck down like everyone else, but his berserker trance kept him clinging to this world long enough to see the strange thing take a young boy, the only survivor, and stuff him inside of a sack of cloth.
"What are you?"
Viggo called out, unsure if he was in this world or the next. The creature smiled and replied,
"As long as there are holy days for thee, I too shall be."
Then the fell thing departed. In the morning, Viggo found himself still alive, but forever shaken. Emil bookended the telling by saying that Viggo lived to marry and thus continue his line down to Emil himself, or so the story goes. By this point, Friedrich and his parents were equally unnerved, but Emil simply smiled and made an offer he was waiting to make for the whole evening. "I think I will return your hospitality now. How about tomorrow night? You all stay at my family home, and we will tell a happier story." As Emil said this, his eyes were fixated on the window. Out there in the dark was a shape not unlike a snowman, a shape that had chosen its next target, but perhaps would need to reconsider for the first time in almost 100 years. Merry Yule, you old devil. All we hope is that you will not see what the blood-red sky Kishar saw as he ran through the streets. All around him were the sounds of violence, women screaming as their babies were stolen from their arms, axes swung towards men who were just trying to protect their families. Kishar's sandals fell apart as he ran, the leather falling from his feet as the hard stones drew blood. All around him was red, the blood from his feet, the burning buildings, and, of course, the cursed sky above his head. Kishar ran out through the gates of the city and into the wilderness. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw smoke engulfing the skies. Above it all stood the Tower of Babel, a shadow hidden in smoke beneath the blood-red sky. What had once been a source of refuge, hope, and wisdom for Kishar now looked like the arrival of hell on Earth. The Persian army swarmed around the city like ants, blowing holes in the city walls and torching house after house. Arrows flew with total abandon. He wasn't sure if they were even being fired at anyone in particular. All night, he had been waiting for one of them to lodge itself between his shoulder blades, but somehow, he had survived. Kishar ran through the desert until his legs gave out on him. He lay on his back, staring up at the night sky. No longer was it just red, but purple and blacks and blues and colors he'd never even seen before. Things his eyes didn't quite understand. As much as he had been afraid of the Persian army, a new fear crept into his stomach, one deeper and more primal. It wasn't just the Persian army who were bringing judgment to his people. It was God himself. Fear pushing him to keep going. The armies would find him within a day if he stopped here. He needed to hide, to find somewhere safe that he could spend the night. On the horizon was a rocky outcrop. There must be a cave in there somewhere. There had to be. An hour later, Kishar stumbled through the rocks, leaving bloody footprints with every step. His mouth was hoarse and dry, his legs burned and wobbled, barely capable of supporting his weight anymore. "Stop!" The voice echoed between the cliffs, becoming so loud that Kishar believed he'd truly found God. But it was a man, or rather, a group of men, dressed in black and white robes. They were standing at the entrance to a cave. They were well dressed, looked well fed and clean. Perhaps they could help him. Unable to speak, he mimed desperately for water as he collapsed on the ground at their feet. But all that he was met with was a jab from one of their staffs. Wincing, Kishar rolled onto his back and whispered his pleas up at them. All that the man told him was that he was to go far, far away from this place and forget he had ever seen it. Kishar tried to explain that the Persian army had invaded, Babylon had fallen, and that it was all over. But the man just carried on staring at him, seemingly unfazed by what he told them. One of them looked up at the sky, at the dark, swirling colors, and gestured to the others. "Come, we must return inside. The sky is worse than I feared." Driven crazy by desperation, Kishar pushed himself to his feet, barged his way past the men, and sprinted into the cave. His foot caught a rock, and he went tumbling, rolling down, along a slope that led deep into the earth. Behind him, he could hear the men shouting and chasing. All he needed was a drink. He would take their water, endure their beating, and be on his way. But he looked up. His blood ran cold. He was not alone in this cave. There, suspended in front of him, was a kind of ball. It was slightly larger than he was and hung in the air without anything to support it. His eyes could not make sense of what they were seeing. The ball shimmered like shallow water being agitated by someone's hand. It was black and white, the colors fighting against each other like droplets of rain that were thrown around by the wind. But at the same time, it wasn't those things. He could see through it slightly. He could see the other wall of the cave. Kishar stood up and slowly crept around the side of the ball, not even noticing the voices of the men crying louder in his ears. Looking through, it was as though the world was bent out of shape, flickering and juddering with energy. He reached out a curious hand. What will it feel like to touch the thing? To feel a miracle with his hand? His trembling fingers crept closer and closer to the edge of the orb. He took a breath and plunged his arm inside. Immediately, pain like he had never experienced shot through his body, and that was when he saw it. On the other side of the orb, standing with its back pressed against the wall of the cave, was something so horrific that the air left his lungs, thrashing and screaming. By the time the man reached the cave, Kishar had collapsed on the floor. He died soon after. As two of the men went about carrying his body back out of the cave, another sat quietly in the corner with the Epic of Gilgamesh open on his lap, reading in a calm voice and watching as over in the corner of the room, the orb gradually shrunk in size. If at any point the sky begins to change color without any stimuli or obvious explanation as to why it's happening, all Foundation members are immediately to go into Alert Level 7. All personnel stationed at Sites 05 and 06 to go into Alert Level 8 and immediately begin to prepare new methods for containing SCP-001. Site 5 has been constructed around Point Alpha, the place where all of this begins. Point Alpha is believed to have existed for thousands of years. The earliest known records of its existence come from the Babylonian Empire. A number of manuscripts make reference to the existence of this cave, and a group of sages known as the Order of White and Black. It was their duty to patrol the cave and protect it from anyone discovering what was hidden inside. At the fall of the Babylonian Empire, as the Achaemenid Persians invaded, this order was replaced by a group of Zoroastrian monks of whom there are few written records. Much of their history was passed down orally. The most substantial account that the Foundation has to date comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Zira, who made an expedition into the Achaemenid Empire and found Point Alpha. Unlike most who came before him, the monks welcomed Zira into the cave with open arms. He had spent years traveling, deepening his understanding of philosophy and culture. He was a great lover of literature, and early on in his travels, he acquired so many manuscripts he had been forced to purchase a camel just so that he could take them all with him. Traveling from town to town, he had collected story after story, myth after myth, from all the local peoples, with the goal of finding what it was that unified humanity across cultures, races, and religions. It was because of his camel that the monks were so happy to see him. They rushed him inside and almost immediately began to unpack his things and lay them out in a special chamber that they had dug into the cave walls. All night they prepared extravagant food for him, slaughtering a goat and preparing it over the open flames in celebration. It was only once he was well rested they introduced him to what was housed deeper in the cave. Zira had the same fearful reaction that Kishar had centuries before, only he had the common sense not to put his hand into the ball. But the stillness of the monks around him helped to put him at ease. They calmly explained to him that it was his turn to read a story and that he may pick any tales he liked from his collection of manuscripts. They beckoned him over to a cushion on one side of the cave, where he knelt and began to read. As he did so, he saw the creature inside the orb for the first time. It skirted around the opposite wall of the cave and peered at him with a look something like curiosity. The creature wasn't a human. That much was apparent. It was emaciated like many of the children that he had seen on his travels, but unlike them, it was enormous. Its hunched figure seemed to fill up the cave and in another way, seemed to be beyond the cave. Somehow his eyes couldn't quite make sense of what they were seeing, but as he read, the creature seemed to find contentment. It was very still and very focused on his words. He wondered if it could even understand what he was saying, so he paused and decided to ask it that question. Almost immediately, the creature began to thrash its way in that either agony or rage distorted its face. Zira tried to calm it down, to talk gently to it, to reassure that everything was okay, but nothing made a difference. The sphere itself started to pulse and grow larger, rippling and shaking with energy. The monks yelled at him to continue reading, and he did so. No sooner had he read the next sentence than the creature seemed to calm, and the sphere began to shrink again. How interesting. All told, Zira spent 7 months living in the cave with the monks. He exhausted all of the literature that he had brought with him, while making sure to write detailed notes every evening about what he had witnessed and what he had learned. Firstly, it seemed as if the creature did understand him, because when he read stories that were of higher quality with more interesting characters and greater stakes, it seemed to be calmer and more interested in what he had to say. The weaker stories that he had picked up, local folklore and cautionary tales, had less of an effect, and the creature seemed closer to agitation as he read them. On a number of occasions, he had been forced to abandon the story early in favor of a better one, as the creature on the other side of the orb seemed to run out of patience for what he was saying. Yet, it would not speak back to him. He heard no voice and saw no attempts from this creature to communicate with him in any way. It did not seem to build any kind of emotional connection with him. It did not matter whether he was reading or one of the monks was. All the creature seemed to care about was the quality of what was being read to it. Apparently, that was what all the monks cared about as well. As soon as Zira had run out of manuscripts to read to the creature, he was escorted out of the cave and sent on his way without so much as a loaf of bread. Following the conquest of Alexander the Great, Point Alpha was once again claimed by a different civilization. Enraptured by the writings of Zira, Alexander had made a specific point to conquer this region. He established his own order known as the Chronos Guard, to whom he gave a selection of the finest Greek epics to read inside the cave. It was their belief that they had found Kronos and were punishing him by reading these tales. The group stood throughout the rise of the Sassanid Empire and even the formation of the Rashidun Caliphate, before eventually being replaced by an Islamic equivalent named the Society for the Containment of the Babel Demon. Presently, Point Alpha is under the control of the SCP Foundation. The cushion and the monk in the corner have been replaced by a speaker about 5 meters away from the anomaly, herein referred to as SCP-001-1. Whatever it is that is living inside, or on the other side of the sphere, is referred to as SCP-001-2. The speaker that reads into it is run from a series of backup generators, so that at no point will there be a break in the flow of literature. The speaker is connected directly to Site-06 and the SCIP-Net database. Due to the inherent danger of close proximity to SCP-001-1, no personnel are authorized to visit Point Alpha anymore. Anything that comes into physical contact with SCP-001-2 is immediately turned into argon gas. It is the Foundation's goal through reading literature to keep SCP-001-2 entertained at all times. If at any point the literature stops, or SCP-001-2 is not satisfied by the quality of what is being read to it, SCP-001 will occur. This refers to the event where SCP-001-1 starts to expand, and the sky spontaneously changes color, initially turning blood red. If not rapidly controlled, this soon constitutes a reality breakdown event. Natural disasters begin to happen all throughout the world and in various places. Reality itself starts to fall apart. It goes without saying, this is not ideal. In order for humanity to survive and perhaps the universe itself to continue, it is of utmost importance that SCP-001-2 receives constant high-quality entertainment. Security classification of this SCP was temporarily lowered, so that all Level 2 personnel would have access to the file and the ability to suggest solutions. One of the first suggestions that was raised was the idea of using artificial intelligence to constantly generate story content to be read over the speaker. This suggestion was approved and quickly put into practice, but almost immediately SCP-001-2 began to thrash violently, and SCP-001-1 rapidly expanded. This led directly to a currently redacted natural disaster on the other side of the world in the mid-2000s. Another suggestion was that the Foundation employ a team of the world's best authors and writers to continually pen stories to satisfy the creature. This suggestion was denied, as historical documentation has proven time and time again that SCP-001-2 does not respond well to literature that has been written specifically for it. The stories must be organic and serve a greater purpose. A recent containment breach pushed the Foundation to start experimenting with methods that they had previously denied. The most important of these was the reading of a mainless document from the SCP Foundation itself to the creature. Previously, the suggestion had been shut down, as it would constitute an information leak, but desperation led the Foundation to try reading one of the accounts of a different SCP to it. This was an overwhelming success. The SCP document was able to be read over 14 times before SCP-001-2 got bored of hearing it. Off the back of this trial, the Foundation approved the declassification of a number of SCP mainless documents to be read to SCP-001-2. At first, there were only 999 SCPs that could be read to it, but as the Foundation crept towards running out of numbers, they decided to expand beyond 999 SCPs, up to 7,999. As of right now, this is where the total sits, but the Foundation may be forced in the future to expand even beyond that number. Most interestingly of all, the Foundation seems to have stumbled upon a more permanent solution: the creation as a file describing SCP-001 itself, perhaps even in the form of an animated video. SCP-001-2 seems to demonstrate a level of enjoyment for stories that mention itself. But the added layer suggested by the Foundation member was that this animated video could be recursive, like the images you see zoom in closer and closer and closer without ever really stopping or getting any closer to a conclusion. A video that could be cyclical and start itself again so that the story would never cease. After all we hope is that you will never see the blood-red sky Kishar saw as he ran through the streets. All around him were the sounds of violence, women screaming as their babies were stolen from their arms, axes swung towards men who were just trying to protect their families. Kishar's sandals fell apart as he ran, the leather falling from his feet as the hard stones drew blood. All around him was red. Russell's back was pressed against the wall, his shuddering hands gripping the fire axe. The low emergency lighting filling the corridor indicated the lockdown was still in effect, although that was simultaneously a blessing and a curse. Sure, it meant that thing couldn't get out, hopefully, but it also meant that Russell was stuck in the wing of the facility with it. He had no idea if anyone else was left. He hadn't seen what had happened to Carpenter. Maybe it got him, or perhaps he had managed to give it the slip at the last second. There was no way of knowing for sure. It had all started so simply, so innocently, and with such noble intentions. If he had known it would lead to all this madness, Russell would have never put his name down on the request form. The SCP Foundation had been working on a way to neutralize or cure SCP-610 for what felt like forever. To one team of scientists, the infamously so-called flesh that hates was a fascinating organism. It was a highly contagious sarkic skin disease, isolated entirely within a small area of Siberia. That on its own wasn't enough to pique the interest of the research team led by Dr. Carpenter, including his hand-picked star researchers Russell and David, along with their assistant Clennon and Dr. Botten, an expert on infectious diseases who had recently joined their efforts to provide his specialist knowledge. What did captivate all of them, however, was what SCP-610 did when it infected a human being. The disease would trigger aggressive and uncontrollable mutations within its infected and could virtually rewrite their entire physiology in a heartbeat. The flesh that hates was capable of transforming a person's body into a horrifying fleshy mass of limbs and matter that barely resembled a human being anymore. And in addition, the infected individuals would retain some level of awareness, attacking any uninfected person with extreme hostility. There had long been chatter amongst some other research teams studying SCP-610 about devising a way to weaponize the disease. If they could somehow create a variant that didn't turn people into monsters, or at least cause the fleshy abominations to die shortly after mutation, then the Foundation or another interested party could deploy the flesh that hates as a biological weapon. Dr. Carpenter had long abhorred the idea, instead searching for a way to completely reverse the effects of an SCP-610 infection. It may have been idealistic, perhaps even naive by some standards, but the rest of his team was behind him in the pursuit of that noble goal, although not one of them knew it would soon cost them their lives. Hitting speed bump after speed bump in their research, the team were beginning to lose hope. Researcher David was the most outspoken in how tired he was of seeing the same results, yelling in frustration that the flesh could not be cured by conventional means. However, it was that outburst that gave Russell the idea. They had tried treating SCP-610 like a common virus, as if it was any other form of disease, largely thanks to Dr. Botten's input. And granted, that approach had taught them a lot about the flesh's ability to contaminate a subject from a single cell. But this infection was anomalous through and through. Could the solution to eradicating it for good lie not in a medical cure, but in another SCP? Russell brought this hypothesis to the rest of the research team, and each of them had suggestions for other anomalies they could potentially use to cure a subject of the flesh that hates. We could get SCP-049 to take a look at the infected patient, Clennon suggested. Oh, might work, Carpenter mused. Although even if he cures someone, he might also kill them. He has his whole deal about ridding the world of the pestilence could prove to be a problem. There's always 682, David said dryly. Have the reptile eat up all the SCP-610 infectees and voila, problem solved. Oh, real helpful, David, researcher Russell retorted. And what are we gonna do when SCP-682 adapts to the flesh? You really want an infected immortal lizard on the loose? Gentlemen, please, Dr. Botten spoke up. We're forgetting one obvious option. I propose we submit a joint formal request to use SCP-914 for this experiment. Unanimously, the group all agreed that this was the best course of action. SCP-914, or the Clockworks, was a giant machine with two booths marked Input and Output. Although the Foundation still couldn't fully comprehend exactly how SCP-914 seemed to take any object placed within it and disassemble, recreate, improve, or destroy the item depending on its current setting. There was one issue, however. A prior failed experiment wherein a D-class was placed in SCP-914 had led to some pretty disastrous consequences. As a result, ever since, no organic matter was to be placed within the Clockworks, a rule that the team's experiment with the flesh would breach. Still, they pressed on, each of the 5 researchers signing their request to utilize SCP-914 before it was submitted to the Foundation higher-ups. Within hours, the request was denied, but the team was determined that SCP-914 could be the key to solving the Foundation's long-standing issue with SCP-610. Dr. Carpenter repealed the decision, urging the higher-ups to reconsider. He argued that this flouting of the no organic matter rule was necessary to potentially rid the world of the flesh that hates. After a few days of consideration, the request was finally, fatefully, granted. The team went to work immediately, requisitioning 2 test subjects, both of which had suffered SCP-610 infections and were horribly mutated. The pair of them were deemed a potential hazard to every member of Foundation staff on site, and as a result, the entire wing of the facility where the Clockworks was housed had to be evacuated for safety. Dressed in biohazard suits to protect themselves, the researchers used an electric cattle prod to coax the first flesh specimen into the input chamber of SCP-914. This was the test run. They wanted to see if the Clockworks would actually be able to affect those infected with SCP-610 at all. Plus, they needed a failsafe just in case something went wrong. And luckily, the machine had just the thing. Russell asked Clennon to set the Clockworks to rough, and with a click and whir of its numerous gears and gyros, SCP-914 came to life. Instantly, the infected test subject was completely obliterated. The setting had reduced it to atoms, disintegrating it on such a microscopic level that there was nothing left in the output chamber. The second infected creature seemed to bristle with anger, but didn't attack or become aggressive, as it too was prodded towards the Clockworks. Next, perhaps out of fear that their theory might be wrong, the team agreed to set SCP-914 to its 1-to-1 setting. Sure enough, the machine recreated another instance of a specimen infected with the flesh that hates, replacing the previous one. We all know we're stalling, researcher David piped up. Let's do what we came here for. Set the Clockworks to course. Nervously receiving a nod from Dr. Carpenter, Clennon stepped forward to switch the dial on SCP-914 to the course setting. This was the primary reason the team had all agreed to use the machine on a flesh specimen. This setting could disassemble any item placed in the input booth, separating it into its base components. Botten had suggested the use of SCP-914 based on the theory that, if it worked correctly, the Clockworks could extract the flesh that hates from its infected host, rendering them free of the disease. The machine made a colossal amount of noise as Clennon hurried back to a safe distance with the others. But as it was powering up, seconds from activating, Dr. Carpenter noticed something. The color drained from his face as he saw it. None of the others had noticed from a distance that the dial hadn't been set to coarse. Instead, it pointed to very fine, the highest refinement setting 914 had.
What the hell have you done?
Carpenter yelled at Clennon before the machine suddenly activated. What stepped free from the output booth stunned the researcher. It was a man, a seemingly ordinary human, who had presumably been infected by SCP-610 some time ago. He stepped nervously out of the machine, looking confused for a moment as a pair of Foundation security guards cautiously approached him. "We did it," Russell said in awe. Suddenly, fleshy tendrils burst forth from the man's arms, latching on to the approaching guards. They screamed in agony, their bodies melting become a bloody, misshapen mass. that stayed attached to the humanoid creature at the center. It was like they became a part of it, the guards' arms and legs forming additional limbs as their forms were reconstituted and repurposed as part of a monster that was now crawling on its 6 legs towards the research team. In a blind panic, the group scrambled for the entrance, the head of the infected man splitting open down the middle, opening up into a wide, snapping pair of jaws. Panting hard as he ran, his breath fogging up the clear faceplate of the biohazard suit, Russell ran through the door, hearing someone close behind. He stopped for a moment, looking back to see the creature on the other side of the door, starting to spill through the doorframe like a liquid. Running faster around a corner, Russell came to another halt in the common area. A third security guard following just before a thick steel security door came slamming down, sealing the creature on the other side.
The other door didn't hold it! What good is that going to do?
Researcher David yelled.
More to the point,
Dr. Carpenter said, turning and marching towards Clennon. He launched a furious punch at the assistant, knocking him to the floor.
Why did you set 914 to very fine, Clennon?
The enraged doctor shouted.
You're the one who unleashed that abomination, you maniac!
What? Clennon replied, fearfully trembling.
I didn't. I swear I didn't. It said course. I'm sure of it. You expect us to believe that was a mistake? Gentlemen, we need to focus on the situation at hand,
the security officer interjected.
Regardless of who's responsible, we need to inform the Foundation higher-ups.
There's an emergency lockdown, Russell replied. It would have triggered the moment the SCP-610 specimen got free.
You've trapped us with a monster, Clennon,
Dr. Carpenter spat. Hold on, Researcher David spoke up. Wasn't it Botton's idea to use 914 in the first place? The common area fell silent as everyone turned to look at Dr. Botton. Did you plan for this, Doc? David pushed. Botton chuckled. Need I remind you, my friends, that we all agreed to use the clockworks, did we not? All of our names are on the request, he answered. Besides, accusing me, David, that's rather rich coming from you. What's that supposed to mean? The researcher fired back. Beckoning his finger, Botton encouraged the rest of the team to follow him across the common area to where a row of lockers stood, each door bearing one of their names. He gestured to the one labeled David. Go on, Botton added. Shooting him a dirty look, David barged past the disease expert and opened his locker. Not one among the group expected what would fall out. It was an old leather-bound book, symbols carved into the front cover. Instantly, thanks to the work studying SCP-610, the researchers all knew a text on sarcasm when they saw one. It had been long known that the flesh that hates was often described in texts revered by Sarkic cults, who worship death, decay, and disease.
What the hell, David?
Russell exclaimed, picking up the book and examining it in disbelief.
You're a Sarkist?
Carpenter asked, the fury in his voice already elevating.
No, I'm not!
Researcher David protested.
I've never seen that before. It was in your locker,
the doctor yelled.
You're one of those cannibal cultists. This was your plan, to refine the flesh for your twisted, death-worshipping religion.
It certainly seems that way, Botton interjected. After all, Researcher David did seem frustrated at our earlier results. Impatient, even.
You!
David pointed at the doctor.
You planted this in my locker!
You're here a Sarkist, Clennon repeated in a nervous stammer. You made me turn the dial to very fine. You made that thing appear.
You made me your accomplice!
Anger tears streamed down his face. Clennon's hand reached for the security officer's gun and went to draw it, planning to shoot David on the spot. But as he went to pull the weapon from the guard's holster, it wouldn't budge. It was then that Assistant Clennon stared in horror at his hand. His fingers had fused to the guard's leg. The officer gave a twisted grin as his torso burst open, tendrils of flesh latching onto Clennon and assimilating him. Just like it had done before, the flesh creature broke down its victim's body, making it a new part of itself, a grotesque mass of limbs and bloody matter, littered with the discarded faces of those it had infected. The research team looked at it terrified, their stomachs turning, disgusted at the growing, growling abomination of bodies fused to one another.
Oh, you're beautiful,
Russell heard a voice whisper behind him. He turned to see Botton, looking at the SCP-610 creature and smiling. Researcher David was the closest, and the creature lunged at him, pulling his leg out from under him. Screaming in fear, the researcher fell onto the ground and was dragged towards the flesh. It pulled him in, his body stretching, skin tearing and bones snapping as he became part of it. A new set of limbs added to the monster. Dr. Carpenter went to try and pull him free, but it was already too late. But he stepped back, knowing that if he touched it, he would be infected too. The sound of running caught Russell's attention, and he spotted Botan making a break for it. Grabbing Dr. Carpenter by the sleeve, the researcher pulled him in the same direction, partly running away from the flesh as it assimilated David, and partly chasing the Sarkic saboteur. The pair of them quickly caught up to Botan, leaning over himself and panting breathlessly.
Thank God you two made it.
He wheezed after the run.
I can't believe David could do this to unleash this nightmare upon us.
Russell thought to snap at him, to scream how dare he keep lying, but Botan's back was to him now. He'd never get a better chance. There was a cabinet on the corridor wall containing a fire axe for emergencies. As carefully and quietly as he could, Russell fished the axe out of its case whilst Botan and Carpenter were looking away.
We should get the Foundation to lift the lockdown, Botan was saying. They need to let us out and then— Oh! Oh!
He let out a blood-curdling scream mid-sentence as the axe blade wounded him. Russell pulled it back, standing over the doctor as he fell to the floor in agony.
Russell, have you lost your mind?
Carpenter exclaimed. No, Doctor. He's the cultist. I have no idea how he tricked Glennon, but that flesh creature exists because of him, the researcher answered. From the floor, unable to move thanks to his injury, Dr. Botan began to laugh.
It took me years to infiltrate the Foundation. So much time waiting to gain access to that blessed flesh, he gloated. And now you've helped me to refine it, to create its ultimate form. You want to kill me? Go ahead, Russell. My life doesn't matter. For once that creature is free, it will bring about a new age of flesh, and Grand Karcist Iron will reward me for the role I played in unleashing it.
David was right, Carpenter realized.
Botan, you've planted that book on him to throw us off.
Doctor, we need to think of something, Researcher Russell interjected, axe still in hand. Nobody knows more about the flesh that hates than us. There must be a way to kill that thing. Otherwise, if it gets out of this lockdown, it could spread to everyone in the Foundation. What about fire? That's been effective against 610 infectees before, right?
Yes, but
the doctor desperately tried to think. This new being we've created.
He created,
Russell argued, looking at the grimacing, wounded Botan. We cannot deny the role we've all played in this, Researcher, Carpenter argued. And we have no idea if it possesses the same weaknesses as the flesh before its refinement.
But we have to try, sir,
the researcher protested. Of course, I agree. The sickening sound of a slithering, slick mass was rapidly approaching. Still laying on the floor in pain, Dr. Botan had been dragged to the middle of a junction, with Carpenter and Russell hiding around either corner. Suddenly, Botan started hollering as the flesh came into view, practically calling it to him.
Oh, look at you! He exclaimed. You're better than I could have ever hoped for.
Looking down at him with the faces it had collected, the creature stabbed one of its disgusting appendages through Botan, drawing its body into its growing form.
I am honored to give my life so that the age of flesh may begin,
the doctor said weakly, through the pain as he was infected. From around the corner, Carpenter had taken the Sarkic text and set its pages on fire with a cigarette lighter. Turning to the creature, he hurled the mass of burning paper at it, hoping it would be enough fire to spread to the flesh while it was assimilating Botan, who they had left there as bait. The fiery book collided with the monstrosity. As Russell peeked around the corner, he saw the flesh retreating from the flames, Botan's body now added to it. For a moment, it seemed like the creature was afraid of the fire, but slowly it drew nearer and nearer to the book. With ease, it stamped down the flames with Botan's leg, dousing the fire and suffering no damage to it at all. Gripping the axe in his hands, Russell went to charge at the creature, only to feel something push him back. Dr. Carpenter had stopped him.
Run!
He yelled. Instantly, Russell turned and raced down the corridor, the sound of fleshy tentacles whipping through the air. He dared not look back, just in case the monster was right behind him. Eventually, he reached another corner and slammed his back against it, hands shuddering as he held on to the fire axe. He had no idea what had happened to Carpenter. Maybe it got him, or perhaps he had managed to give it the slip at the last second.
Russell!
Came a hushed voice from around the corner, one the researcher recognized. He turned to see Dr. Carpenter approaching him, sneaking like he was trying to avoid being heard.
I think I managed to give it the slip,
the doctor whispered. For a second, Russell backed up, his hands tightening around the axe handle. This might have looked like Dr. Carpenter, but was it? Are you really you, Doctor? He asked.
Of course I am,
Carpenter replied.
You don't think that I'm not that monstrosity?
Russell raised the axe defensively, only to notice the sadness in the doctor's face. Unable to bring himself to swing, even to find out, the researcher lowered his weapon. Carpenter looked grateful.
Come on, let's get them to lift this lockdown.
he said. I'm sure an MTF can step in and take care of our mistake. As the pair of them cautiously made their way towards one of the locked doors, Dr. Carpenter reached out a hand to place it on Russell's shoulder. Fearless, relentless, and one of the most utterly brutal warriors to ever walk the face of the earth, with a body count somewhere in the high 100,000s, if not well into multiple millions, given just how long he's been around for. Many of you will already be well aware of SCP-076-2, also known as Abel. On the surface, he's a man of Middle Eastern descent, covered in tattoos of occult symbols and demonic faces, usually contained within a stone cube designated SCP-076-1. Abel will often emerge in a homicidal state, killing anyone and anything directly around him. How? Well, by any means available to him, but primarily by pulling a wide array of bladed weapons seemingly out of thin air. This is thanks to a tiny pocket dimension that only he can reach into, which is also always stocked with an assortment of deadly implements for his latest murder spree. As if being highly combat proficient and always armed didn't make him enough of an imposing threat, SCP-076-2 also possesses a near superhuman resistance to damage, making him incredibly difficult to take down. And even if someone is able to eventually neutralize him, Abel will also come back, resurrecting inside SCP-076-1 to fight another day. What you may not know is, for a time, Abel actually worked alongside the SCP Foundation, although nowadays they prefer to keep him locked away in a secure containment facility underwater, which they will flood with seawater if he ever escapes. But Abel was once appointed the leader of his own mobile task force, Omega-7, referred to under the codename of Pandora's Box. You see, the Foundation realized that SCP-076-2 held an especially high regard for those who proved, well, able to best him in combat. And it was this strange code of honor that Abel held that the Foundation hoped to exploit with the creation of Pandora's Box, comprised of MTF operatives that had earned Abel's respect, most by previously beating him in a fair fight, or as fair as a fight with a man who can summon swords through a tear in the fabric of reality can be. These agents would support Abel during missions in the field, during which the SCP Foundation were able to deploy the anomalous warrior in various tactical engagements. However, this didn't last long. Eventually, Abel grew tired of carrying out the orders of the Foundation. The immortal warrior craved a challenge, breaking free of containment and turning on the Foundation, resulting in Abel being neutralized by an on-site nuclear weapon. This marked the end of the fragile alliance between SCP-076-2 and the SCP Foundation, leaving the existence of Omega-7 a classified secret and one of the organization's most embarrassing missteps. Well, but what if that hadn't happened? What if out there in the infinite multiverse, there was a world where Abel had been allowed to remain a part of Omega-7 and the mobile task force was never disbanded? Well, you're about to find out. In our world, Abel's dissatisfaction with being a member of Pandora's Box first became apparent when he began putting the rest of his unit through live fire exercises, brutalizing his men despite these exercises being intended as for training purposes only. But in this world, the injuries and even casualties Abel inflicted on the rest of Omega-7 were met with a much different response. The O5 Council of this alternate version of the SCP Foundation viewed Abel's outbursts during training as acceptable losses. Every time he would injure one of Omega-7, the Council would demand that replacements be on hand to become part of the task force, drawn from the ranks of the other MTFs at their disposal. After all, Abel was a valuable asset for carrying out the Foundation's dirty work. By continually replenishing his team with reserves from their seemingly inexhaustible supply of other MTF agents, the O5 Council of this world were able to keep SCP-076-2 firmly under their employ. However, it is also important to note that Abel's patience for these new recruits was far more limited than the original Omega-7s. Those men had all been hand-picked by Abel personally and appointed to the project, given that he had some modicum of respect for them as combatants, whereas all of their replacements were plucked at random from the Foundation's other MTFs. As a result, SCP-076-2 would carelessly kill or wound more and more of these reserves during combat missions, hardly distinguishing between friend and foe. But despite this, the O5 Council refused to discontinue the Omega-7 project, viewing these as acceptable losses, and letting the success rate of Abel's missions justify the depletion of their other mobile task forces. Under Abel's leadership and the command of the O5 Council, Omega-7 would become the Foundation's primary rapid response unit and the most deployed task force for dangerous field operations. And working for the Foundation meant that every field mission was a highly dangerous one. Such was the case during one containment breach, where SCP-682 managed to get free of its acid tank. A rampaging, infinitely adaptable, hard-to-destroy reptile on the loose, slaughtering all in its path was bad enough. But the O5 Council had received intel that there was something more behind this breakout than it first seemed. And so Abel and the rest of his latest Omega-7 team were sent in to pacify SCP-682. Bursting into the facility, eager to once again be freed from containment and the monotonous, underwhelming experience of training, Abel flew into combat. Drawing black swords from his personal armory, he began to tear through everything and everyone in his path. Unfortunately for the Foundation personnel on site, this also meant they were subject to Abel's relentless wrath. As if running away from SCP-682 wasn't bad enough, fleeing research staff were quickly met with the swing of SCP-076-2's weapons and removed from the premises in a brutal fashion. Still, this meant little to Abel, and even less to the O5 Council. As far as they were concerned, even their own staff were just collateral damage, more acceptable losses justified by Abel's perfect record for successful high-risk, high-reward field missions. However, that perfect record was about to be tarnished for good. You see, this containment breach wasn't your average SCP-682 escape attempt. It was instead a situation that had been meticulously planned and carried out for one purpose. This breach was intended specifically to draw Abel out. Since he had become the SCP Foundation's primary weapon in response to danger in the field, a particularly devious third party had begun to take note. The Chaos Insurgency, a splinter faction that began its life as an off-the-books Black Ops unit for the Foundation themselves, had been monitoring Abel's deployment by the O5 Council. In this universe, their origin was the same as in ours, and the insurgency took a certain disdain to seeing an anomalous individual carrying out the kind of operations their group had been formed to undertake for the Foundation. Additionally, the use of SCP-076-2 as a personal attack dog by the O5 Council is hypocrisy. The insurgency believed in the practical application of anomalies, rather than locking them up and keeping them contained. And it was for this belief that they had been vilified by the Foundation. And yet, here was the same organization sending Abel on missions, with no care for the harm he caused. And so, as a result, the Chaos Insurgency had conducted an operation to break into the Foundation, free SCP-682, and send the hard-to-destroy reptile on a rampage, also they could take their shot at Abel. Being ambushed by a group of Chaos Insurgency operatives on his way to engage SCP-682, Abel was admittedly caught by surprise, but by now, his combat prowess was second to almost nobody else in the world. The insurgents dogpiled on Abel, unleashing every ounce of firepower they had brought to bear on the immortal warrior. The ensuing firefight destroyed an entire wing of the Foundation facilities, explosive weapons being detonated in the hopes that the insurgency could subdue Abel. All the while, SCP-076-2 shrugged off the oncoming damage, catching rockets that were launched at him and throwing them back in the direction of the Chaos Insurgents. It was a bloodbath. Nearly the entire Omega-7 team that had accompanied Abel and provided him with fire support were lying dead. The same could also be said for the insurgency's forces too, though, with each of them being gradually felled by the warrior's many weapons. But by this point, Abel was approaching exhaustion, and there was still one more enemy left standing. It had been unfurling destruction all on its own, angrily devouring the few Foundation personnel that were left. And now the scaly form of SCP-682 came lumbering around the corner. The battle was brutal. In this universe, Abel and the hard-to-destroy reptile had never crossed paths before. But SCP-682 could smell the difference in Abel's physiology, his innate ability to resist damage and resurrect time and time again. The creature already held disdain for anything and everything living, And so, presented with a man who technically couldn't stop living, SCP-682 entered an unstoppable rage state, taking the exhausted Abel down with ease. But losing in a grudge match against SCP-682 wasn't quite as bad as things were about to get for Abel. Reviving inside of his stone sarcophagus, the ancient warrior was confused. The Foundation weren't letting him out. It had been a long time, years even, since he had last died, even temporarily. Over the course of all of his Omega-7 missions, he hadn't needed to reappear back inside SCP-076-1 for quite a considerable while, and now that he had, a very large seed of doubt had been sown. The O5 Council were furious, just as angry at SCP-076-2's apparent failure as Abel was. The perfect operational track record of their top anomalous asset was now tarnished. The question started to spread through the Council members. If their sword-wielding, virtually invulnerable secret weapon wasn't as effective as they had previously thought, then what was the use of continuing to deploy Abel? And so began a debate within the O5 Council upon what was to be the fate of SCP-076-2. In this universe, he had served the Foundation well, but a weapon that is only effective even 90% of the time still leaves a margin of error. It was that risk, that potential for error, knowing that Abel wouldn't always succeed in his missions, that caused the O5 Council to reconsider his applications as a field operative. There were some in the Council who argued that this was a highly specific, isolated incident. The Chaos Insurgency had specifically engineered the SCP-682 escape as a way to draw Abel out, after all. Just because he failed this time did not indicate a pattern of failure, but this argument was eventually shot down, especially when the Foundation's Ethics Committee decided to throw in their 2 cents. They demanded Abel's status as a field agent be revoked, and levied for the immediate disbanding for the Omega-7 project. Pulling replacements for that task force from other MTFs at the Foundation had left them with a significantly depleted reserve of troops. And then came the argument about just how acceptable the losses were when Abel was let loose. A decision was ultimately made to, for at least the moment, rescind SCP-076-2's field operative privileges and suspend any further development of or recruitment into Omega-7. However, there was one crucial factor that nobody on the Council had taken into consideration when they made their verdict, and that was how badly Abel would react to the news. As you may have already predicted, Abel was furious to hear he would be held in containment until further notice. His anger stemmed not from his defeat at the jaws of SCP-682, but at how quick the Foundation seemingly was to question his combat prowess. He lost one battle out of hundreds, thousands even, and all of a sudden the O5 Council were going to lock him away, all because of one defeat?
You dare?
Abel bellowed when he was given the news.
I am the greatest warrior on this planet and have been made a pawn by your Foundation. I give you my strength, my skill, and the moment I falter, you turn your back on me? You dare! I will show you what real power looks like!
Overcome with rage, it didn't take long for Abel to force his way out of containment. He'd been active as a field agent within the Foundation for so long now that he had long since figured out a way to escape his underwater prison before the emergency containment measures had a chance to stop him. As he broke free, he made sure to take down plenty of security staff along the way, and to make matters worse, he didn't stop there. Before long, Abel was on a warpath against the SCP Foundation. Every few days, reports would come in of a massacre at a Foundation facility. Security footage recovered from the wreckage after each incident would show Abel arriving primed for battle, a sword in each hand. By the time he left after his brutal, remorseless attack, he'd be drenched in the blood of the entire site's personnel. The Foundation had little in its once huge arsenal to fight back with. Given the number of MTF agents reassigned to Omega-7, their forces were far more limited, if not almost depleted. They dispatched detachments to clean up the wake of Abel's destruction, but not one squad sent after the anomalous warrior came back alive. Part of the problem was, the Foundation couldn't predict where Abel would show up next, or which of their sites he knew about and was planning to hit. From their perspective, his attacks were spontaneous, the result of rage at the Foundation, but without any premeditated plan in mind. And that was exactly what Abel wanted them to think. By seeming to attack at random, He was, therefore, able to cover the true intention behind each engagement. He was looking for something. During his considerable time leading Omega-7, he had heard about a machine that could improve anything placed inside of it, SCP-914, better known as the Clockworks, and before long, Abel found what he was looking for. By the time the Foundation realized what the Unstoppable Warrior's plan was, it was already too late. Abel was storming into the facility that housed SCP-914 with no intention of leaving until he'd used it. The Foundation had banned testing of biological matter within the Clockworks, but Abel wasn't beholden to their rules anymore. In fact, he barely was when he'd worked with them before. Cutting down guards and researchers, survivors fleeing in terror, Abel stepped up towards the massive gears and cogs, the clockwork components that made up SCP-914. He wasted no time, setting the machine to very fine. With this setting, the Clockworks would take whatever was in the input booth and improve it, usually by giving it anomalous properties, or in the case of Abel, by giving him further anomalous properties. Stepping inside, the whir of machinery drowned out the emergency alarms as Abel reached his goal, to become the ultimate warrior, the embodiment of the very concept itself. Racing to the scene, a chopper cleared the smoke as it approached. Under an emergency executive order from the O5 Council, the few surviving remnants of the Foundation's mobile task forces had been combined into a singular strike team. There were not many left, considering how many others from their units had been previously siphoned into Omega-7, only to die as collateral damage in the team's missions with Abel.
Remember, SCP-076-2 is a priority target!
The field commander barked, while the MTF strike team held their guns nervously aboard the aircraft.
Primary objective is to neutralize him by any means. Reports indicate that he may be trying to access SCP-914, so be advised!
An almighty explosion boomed through the airborne vehicle, engulfing the cockpit in flames.
Mayday! 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 Chopper 1 has been hit! We're going down!
The commander radioed to Foundation Command.
Everyone brace yourselves for impact!
The helicopter spiraled out of the air, crashing to the ground in a twisted hunk of metal. The surviving members of the strike team scrambled out of the wreckage, hauling the more badly wounded out of the ruined aircraft.
Contact!
Someone yelled in horror.
Enemy contact behind us!
The remaining Foundation foot soldiers turned and drew their weapons, opening fire on something suspended a few feet in the air above them. A hail of gunfire rang out as the team opened fire the second they saw who it was. It was Abel, and he was flying. Floating above them, his hair whipped in the wind. The oncoming storm of bullets seemed to ricochet off his skin. In actuality, they weren't even hitting him, melting away before they could make contact. They might as well have been firing pea shooters for how little effect their guns had. The barrage only stopped when one of the strike team launched a short-range rocket at the newly refined warrior. It detonated, but when the smoke from the blast cleared, Abel was still hovering in the air without so much as a scratch.
My turn,
he announced. Reaching into his pocket dimension, Abel pulled something out. Not a weapon, not yet. Instead, it was a formless, dark, shadowy mass that moved like liquid metal, reacting to the movement of his hand. As he drew the substance out, it reformed, seemingly at Abel's command. And it wasn't just swords he could create now. Drawing on his experiences from his Omega-7 missions, any weapon that Abel had previously seen or could think of, he now had at his disposal. The strike team looked up in horror as a veritable swarm of black, non-reflective constructs hovered in the air on either side of Abel, each one in the shape of a rocket. Flinging both arms towards the Foundation troops, Abel sent his new creations raining down on them. The strike team turned heel and fled for their lives, although none of them got very far. Abel's rockets engulfed the area around them in a volley of explosions, leaving not a single thing standing. He had just effortlessly built an airstrike from virtually thin air and thrown it at the Foundation's last remaining MTF agents. And he wasn't done there. With his newfound powers, Abel's campaign of destruction swept the entire world. In a last act of desperation, the SCP Foundation offered freedom to any anomaly that permanently took down SCP-076-2. They all flooded out of containment to take their shot. The Plague Doctor, the Shy Guy, the Spectre. But they barely slowed Abel down. His new constructs were devastating weapons, taking the form of not just blades, but projectiles of every size and shape, all of them lethal. Before long, Abel had lain waste to the entire Foundation, but still, he wanted more. SCP-914 hadn't just improved Abel's existing anomalous powers and granted him the ability to fly at supersonic speeds. In doing so, it had amplified his range, too. He loathed the human race and sought to absolutely decimate every single living thing. No one could best him in combat now, and in his mind, twisted by anger, not one of them was worthy of his respect. He tore planes apart with his bare hands, smashed tanks to pieces, and leveled entire cities with his unlimited weapons. It took a few years, maybe a decade at the most, but by the end of it, Abel sat atop a pile of billions upon billions of bones. With his refined abilities, he had done something unthinkable, committed omnicide. He had killed everyone in the world. Of course, this was indeed another world, one different to ours. Luckily here, our version of Abel is still locked up underwater, but somewhere out there is an Abel who is watching the sun rising over an entirely dead world, his world. MTF agents scramble through the crowd of bloodthirsty, hypnotized festival goers. Up on the stage, a pair of living statues hold down a screaming man as they produce medieval instruments of torture from an antique case. Maybe this time the agents can stop it. Maybe they can prevent all the horror and bloodshed. But one thing stands in their way. A man-sized, cartoonish dove costume flying down towards them, wielding a large wooden mallet that would only bring death and destruction. Needless to say, even by Foundation standards, this one is going to be weird. When you found yourself sought out by the SCP Foundation's recruitment division and offered a role in the research department, they made sure to inform you of the risks. After all, a workplace injury in this line of work might be far more serious than slipping on a wet floor or developing carpal tunnel from typing all day. Working within the ranks of the Foundation, you could be the unfortunate victim of any number of dangerous anomalies, whether it's SCP-096 appearing behind you after you accidentally caught a glimpse of it as a single pixel in a photo, or if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time whenever SCP-682 next broke out, then chances are you'd be receiving an early redundancy and a closed casket service, if there's even enough of you left to bury. It is the one thing you never want to happen, the scenario you're constantly warned about from the moment you join the Foundation, a containment breach. Anything can be the cause of an anomaly breaking free of containment and spreading untold chaos in the process. Whether it's the result of a particularly cantankerous SCP that doesn't take kindly to being locked up, an act of earnest human error with disastrous consequences, or even international sabotage enacted by a group of interests trying to seize anomalies for their own purposes. There is no telling when or where a containment breach might occur, or is there? Despite all the resources at their disposal, specialized facilities spanning the globe, advanced technology, and a nearly inexhaustible supply of personnel to contain SCPs, the Foundation still manages to suffer catastrophic casualties as a result of containment breaches. But surely, if they're so well equipped, such breaches should be almost impossible, right? Well, yes. So what causes them? What if every containment breach, all the loss of life, the further spread of anomalies, and the destruction of Foundation property incurred was all caused by an SCP? Not a living entity, mind you, more some kind of latent anomalous phenomenon that triggers containment breaches without warning. The prevailing theory surrounding this phenomenon is even itself considered to be an SCP within its own right, referred to as SCP-001. Of course, as many of those well-versed in the history and practices of the SCP Foundation will already know, SCP-001 is a designation shared by a number of anomalies. Some are believed to actually exist, while others are speculated to just be falsified covers created to mask the real SCP-001. From beings such as the Gate Guardian and the Scarlet King, to the existence of God's blind spot and even the Foundation itself, each of these SCP-001s are nicknamed after the Foundation researcher who proposed them for the designation, and often considered to be some of the first, if not the very first anomalies ever encountered, or at least documented. In that regard, this SCP-001, Plague's proposal, could well be one of the very first latent anomalies to exist, explaining why so many SCPs were uncontained prior to the Foundation being established. and why even now, with all their resources, containment breaches are still a worryingly frequent occurrence. There are multiple anomalies that appear to have been directly affected by SCP-001, at least according to the research of one of the Foundation's directors, Director Legg. While he might be drawing conclusions and seeing patterns where there aren't any to speak of, Legg reasons that the circumstances of these specific recorded containment breaches seem to indicate that SCP-001 was at fault. The first of these incidences Director Legg focuses on in his research is also the one we'll be focusing on for the remainder of this video. It is designated as SCP-001-1. SCP-001-1 previously went under the designation of SCP-5770 and is an annual anomalous event that occurs in the Piazza della Signora in Florence, Italy. The event consists of an unscheduled festival that goes on for a period of 10 days, wherein anyone present within a 10-kilometer range of the affected area suffers a mind-altering effect that compels them to attend the festival. However, SCP-001-1 is not a well-documented, long-running festival of great cultural significance to the people of Florence. Neither is it an event that is widely advertised. Yet those who have experienced the psychic draw of this anomalous festival are driven to attendance. During the course of SCP-001-1, two anomalous entities that resemble the statues created by Michelangelo during the Renaissance will host a show where they take to the stage to judge people they deem to be sinners. This pair of statue creatures will call upon the audience and bring those they've designated sinners up onto the stage with them, and will then enact makeshift, grueling punishments. These have been noted to resemble the acts depicted in Dante Alighieri's Inferno. So if you ever need any further proof of how hellish these punishments are, we recommend asking an art expert. The moment that SCP-001-1 ceases and the festival comes to a close, any and all in attendance are subject to yet another form of anomalous mental alteration, and will proceed to instantly forget the event. Any of the horrific tortures performed on stage becomes unknown to those that directly witnessed it, leaving them unaware of anything that occurred only moments prior. So given the Foundation's extensive knowledge of this festival, its gruesome proceedings, and the effects it has on those in attendance, you might be forgiven for expecting them to have a fairly well-established method of keeping the event contained, presumably setting up a cordon to keep attendance out of the area, administering amnestics to any that might have been affected by SCP-001-1's anomalous mind-altering. But then, you remember SCP-001, the theory behind what could be the cause of containment breaches. As a result, the Foundation has still been unable to establish containment of the event formerly known as SCP-5770, and Director Legg's research has tied this issue with containment to SCP-001. Hence the festival's redesignation to SCP-001-1. Following the initial discovery of an anomalous annual occurrence in the city of Florence in 1985, the SCP Foundation's head researcher, assigned to what was then known as SCP-5770, was one Joseph Pasqua, former site director at Site-322. Pasqua was, according to the incidents recorded on the Foundation's own database, somehow manipulated by one of the anomalous statue creatures that performed the show during occurrences of SCP-5770. It was thanks to the influence of this entity that Joseph Pasqua deserted his post at the Foundation and went into hiding. The fact that the influence of one of the performers of this festival was able to extend its influence to a senior member of the Foundation was not only troubling, but also constituted a containment breach. Pasqua would later be tracked down by Foundation agents operating in and around Italy. He was discovered 30 years later after his desertion in Vatican City as a member of the Papal Conclave, a specially selected group of Catholic cardinals that are charged with electing a new pope. If the former site director was still being influenced by the statue creatures, it is highly likely that he spent the previous 3 decades climbing the ranks of the Catholic Church, potentially to install a new pope at the behest of the entities responsible for conducting the torture of the Florence Festival. Another recorded incident of a containment breach surrounding the event that seemed to lend credence to the existence of SCP-001, the anomalous cause of breaches, occurred the year following SCP-5770's discovery. In 1986, the Foundation was observing the proceedings of the festival as part of their ongoing investigation into its bizarre nature. On site were agents of Mobile Task Force Zeta-66, better known under their unit's codename of the Guardian Angels. During the festival, MTF Zeta-66 operatives noticed the presence of a previously unknown entity associated with the anomalous event. The Foundation was already aware of the pair of seemingly living Michelangelo sculptures, designating them as SCP-5770-1 and SCP-5770-2 respectively. This third entity, despite being given the designation of SCP-5770-3, had its own preferred identification for itself. The being referred to itself as God's Strongest Soldier and resembled a mascot costume of a dove. Approximately 2 meters tall, this creature's body was entirely hollow. There was nothing within the costume. The costume was its body. The responding agent of MTF Zeta-66, codenamed Zeta Turquoise, was the first to confront God's Strongest Soldier and was greeted with quite the opener.
Tweedly-dee, tweedly-da, God's Strongest Soldier is my name, getting rid of sin is my game.
Confused at the creature's demeanor and presence, Zeta Turquoise called in a report to command, stating that a large birdman was harassing random attendants of the festival. When Turquoise moved in to confront SCP-5770-3, the creature repeated its assertion that it was God's Strongest Soldier and that its aim was to get people into heaven. The agent requested that God's Strongest Soldier get out of his way. He had a job to do, but the bizarre birdman responded with more whimsical nonsense.
Burger, sandwich, fruit, and fries, you just told a big fat lie!
God's Strongest Soldier proclaimed.
Tweedly-deep-doo-da, deedly-deep-dop-da, pa-pa-da-pa-da-da.
Upon Zeta Turquoise's attempt to push past the creature, SCP-5770-3 produced an oversized wooden mallet, seemingly from out of thin air. It then wound its arms back and immediately, viciously, struck the MTF agent. A low-orbit Foundation satellite reported not long after that an object had been detected exiting the Earth's stratosphere. Analysis confirmed that it was, indeed, Zeta Turquoise. Yes, he was literally yeeted into Earth's orbit by a cartoonishly large wooden mallet. As for the entity known as God's Strongest Soldier, the bird-like creature then proceeded to attack the other members of Mobile Task Force Zeta-66 in a similar fashion, making sure they got to heaven in every sense of the phrase. With multiple recorded instances of containment breaches occurring in relation to the festival in Florence, and happening so frequently, more and more evidence of Director Legge's theory about SCP-001 was being validated. In 1988, the Foundation attempted a different, more pacifistic approach to containing the annual celebration by attempting to cordon off the entrance to the area of Florence where those compelled to attend the festival usually congregated. There was additionally a cover story issued to the public, stating that this was done as a quarantine measure to keep residents away from an area hosting a potentially dangerous infection. For a time, this seemed to be working. The streets were quiet, local residents seemed to be going about their business and paying little mind to the Foundation operatives in the area. That is, until the mind-altering effects of SCP-001-1 took hold. A mass of people, estimated to be over 100,000 Florentines, charged towards the cordon-off area. This mass of people swept through like a tidal wave breaking through a dam, causing Foundation personnel to be trampled alive. Those that survived the initial rush were attacked by civilians in what seemed to be a coordinated effort to reach the gatherings area for the festival. All Foundation agents in the area were terminated in short order, mercilessly slaughtered and then cannibalized before anything that remained of their bodies was dumped into the Arno River nearby. As well as being evidence of the sheer mental alteration the statue creatures and the festival itself were capable of. For Director Legge, this seemed to indicate something further. If an anomaly, SCP-001, was truly responsible for all containment breaches, allowing them to occur in spite of the measures taken to prevent such things happening, then the phenomenon seemed to be occurring specifically to prevent the Foundation from achieving containment of certain SCPs. Legge's theory developed with every passing breach that involved SCP-001-1. In theory, the festival should be an average Tuesday for Foundation staff, a relative walk in the park in order to contain it, if not outright stop it from happening at all. Yet despite all their resources, manpower, and expertise in all things anomalous, the Foundation had been thwarted at every turn. Despite how illogical such occurrences seemed, containment breaches were still occurring at an alarming rate, and perhaps none more so than in relation to SCP-001. The following year, 1989, brought with it the most inexplicable breach yet, and further proof for Director Legge's theory about SCP-001. While the previous breaches were undoubtedly anomalous in nature, each always carrying with the possibility that somehow, despite the low odds, the Foundation missed something. Some human error or previously undiscovered information about the festival could have led to Pasqua's alteration or the arrival of God's strongest soldier. But this time, it was undeniably that a force beyond the scope of the Foundation's understanding was altering reality to prevent them from containing the festival in Florence. An invisible barrier manifested at every entry point to the main area of the anomalous event. Whenever a member of Foundation personnel tried to get in on foot, those that attempted to access the festival area via rappelling out of helicopters instantly caught ablaze and burned to death the moment they touched down on the ground. Any helicopter transports also crashed on their return journey to Site 322, and God's strongest soldier was seen trampling on the wreckage before flapping its arms and flying away. It was following this incident that Legg was promoted to position of Site Director for Site 322 as a replacement for Joseph Pasqua, who was still missing at this time. The newly appointed director was yet to devise his theory that there existed an anomalous cause for all containment breaches. However, during his introductory briefing, he was presented with the file regarding SCP-5770 and the various examples of it not only being uncontainable, but being very good at not being contained. Director Legg asked if some of the more standard methods had been attempted. At this point, the Foundation had tried aerial bombardments of the festival, Scranton reality anchors to counteract whatever anomalous force was preventing containment, even using SCP-682 to clear the area. It had all failed. Figuring out why was now Director Legg's job. All the information of previously failed attempts to contain the festival led Legg to the conclusion that SCP-001 must exist, an unseen phenomenon, the missing piece of the puzzle, the element specifically interfering with the Foundation's efforts. He presented his proposal to the Overseer Council, who were skeptical, to say the least. They posited that the statues and bird mascot creature might be smarter than the latter's outwardly cartoonish nature portrayed. But this is exactly what, to Director Legg, indicated SCP-001 was responsible. He explained that all in attendance at SCP-5770's festival took the event seriously, but the appearance of God's strongest soldier was an abnormality, whose demeanor and tone were drastically different from the rest of the rather cutthroat proceedings. Director Legg explained that the sheer absurdity of this creature seemed to be the result of SCP-001 interfering with their operations. After all, if some other cause was to blame, like an unknown cult attacking Foundation personnel when they attempted to contain the festival, then there would be evidence of that. And Legg would have no reason to suspect that God's strongest soldier was anything more than just a tonally dissonant part of the festival. Of course, Director Legg couldn't prove the existence of SCP-001 based on the presence of one cartoonish bird mascot at a festival. But before long, more and more breaches would start occurring that seemed to further prove that Legg was onto something. There was something else at work, causing containment breaches that put the entirety of the Foundation in jeopardy. The helicopter lurched and rumbled as it made its descent through the Verkhoyansk mountain range. Conditions were harsh, with fierce winds ripping through the valleys. At any point, a blizzard threatened to strike. Just about managing to touch down, Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 was glad to be out of the vehicle, even if it meant stepping into knee-deep snow. There were 8 operatives in total. Early reconnaissance suggested that they were the only people present within a 5-kilometer radius, at least. That's certainly what they hoped. L9 operatives 1 through 6 all made their way up through the mountain pass, leaving 7 and 8 guarding the chopper. This was a simple reconnaissance mission. They would need to search the bunker for any signs of life, gather intel, and get out, hopefully before the snowstorm hit. All 8 of them were kitted out with the Foundation's Keter-grade cutting-edge anti-psionic plating. The operatives had all been chosen carefully, with L9-1 the leader, being an experienced soldier, serving 11 years in the unit. He had capable psionic powers himself, and approached L9-2, who showed some of the same gifts. All of a sudden, as the group rounded the final pass and caught sight of the facility, both 1 and 2 experienced severe migraines. Battered by the Russian wind, they had no choice but to get to the bunker as fast as possible. It looked relatively unassuming, a small concrete slab sitting amongst the mountains. The 6 of them gathered around on either side of the doors as Number 3 forced his way inside. Following standard breaching maneuvers, the rest of the team followed suit, charging in through the open doorway. and immediately tipping forward into an abyss. They all landed hard side by side on the slope, some of them rolling down, clattering against each other, and eventually skidding to a stop. Very gingerly, the group started to get back to their feet and catch their breath, as the wind had been knocked out of all of them. They weren't in a research facility at all. The Soviet concrete walls they'd been expecting, the old computers and the lab equipment were all missing. Instead, they were standing in a void, infinite and white, with no seeming end in any direction. Beneath their feet and curling up above them was an enormous double helix, a rainbow of colors weaving in and out of one another. It was like they had found themselves standing on an enormous strand of DNA. Floating all around them were glowing orbs of light. None of them could tell how near or far these orbs were. They could have been close enough to reach out and touch, or they could have been on the other side of the universe. And slowly, one by one, they noticed the doorway that they had come in through. It was perpendicular to the double helix and floating about 3 meters above their heads. Through it, they could see the snowy Russian mountains, their only chance of escape. 4 murmured something about needing to leave. 1 argued back at him. They had no idea whether that door was real or an illusion. They had no idea if they would even be able to pass through it. Besides, it was 3 meters above their heads and floating out over the void. It was risky. But 4 didn't care much about receiving permission. Taking a few steps back further down the double helix to get a good run-up, he braced himself and sprinted as fast as he could before jumping and reaching for the open doorway. It was as if gravity was suddenly much stronger. As soon as he stepped off the double helix, 4 was wrenched downwards, tumbling and spinning, accelerating faster and faster. He let out a petrified scream that sent the other operatives cowering. There was no bottom, at least not as far as they could see or hear. 4's body just got smaller and smaller, and his screams quieter and quieter for several minutes until the agents couldn't hear him anymore. And yet inside the heads of 1 and 2, the psionic members of the group, that screaming sound only seemed to grow louder. December 25th, 1962. A man walked briskly through the West Berlin train station. He'd shaved his head the night before and trimmed his beard down to a thick mustache. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes and a fedora was tipped forward. He hoped that his limp was convincing as he shuffled his way through the crowds. One advantage of wearing dark sunglasses in the middle of winter was that he could constantly scan the faces of those around him, looking for anybody who looked Russian. His train had been delayed. An hour outside of Berlin, the train had ground to a halt. German police officers had walked the length of the carriages, checking everyone's tickets and passports. It felt like an eternity. The man was too old by this point to attempt to run away. Besides, running through rural Germany in the snow didn't sound like the best plan. So he stuck to his cover story and hoped against hope that the fake passport he bought would be convincing enough. Fortunately for him, the officer checked it. He looked to be about 18 years old. The man doubted that the boy would know a Russian passport if it was signed by Nikita Khrushchev himself. But shuffling through the station, his feeling of unease grew. Russian deserters had been poisoned all around him for the prior 15 years. A number of his own colleagues had mysteriously gone missing after feeling disenfranchised by the Soviet agenda. He was such a high-profile target that there was no way the KGB wasn't actively hunting him down at that very moment. He clutched the briefcase tightly and made his way out of the station. His plan had been to call a taxi, but now the prospect of being alone in an anonymous vehicle with only one other person terrified him. His best protection would be to stay out in the open as much as possible. He would walk to the British embassy, or rather, he'd pretend to limp there. Lambda 9 operatives number 7 and 8 stood by the helicopter shivering. Their team had been missing for hours now, and they could see the blizzard slowly covering the mountain range like a blanket. Before long, it would reach them. If their helicopter got buried by anything more than a couple of inches, all hopes of evacuating back to base would be dashed. As soon as their team had gone through the doors into the facility, all radio contact with them had been cut off. The Foundation had suspected that the bunker would be heavily insulated, but if that were the case, surely one of them would have stepped outside to resume radio contact and report what they had found so far. Then, all of a sudden, 7 went limp. He remained standing, but his head and shoulders slumped forward as if he'd fallen asleep. Perhaps he had been standing out here for too long. 8 was about to rouse him when suddenly 7 started talking. "Hello? 8, can you hear me? It's 1, are you there?" The conversation moved quickly. Somehow 1 had been able to reach out to 7's mind and temporarily take control in order to use him as a mouthpiece to communicate with the Foundation over the radio. This kind of contact would normally have been well beyond what 1 would have been capable of, but he explained that as soon as they had entered the facility, both he and 2 had felt their powers growing immeasurably. The Foundation asked for a situation report, and 1 updated them about what had happened to 4. Trying to escape through the door, he jumped and fell through the abyss. But what was more sickening was that they had seen 4 again. All of a sudden, they had started to hear his screams physically, not psionically, and he had fallen past them just off to their right, almost within touching distance. Having decided that it was too risky to attempt an escape as 4 had done, the group of them made the decision to travel further down into the facility, descending along the helix. For the next 3 hours, 7 is unresponsive. He stands there limp in the snow, hunched forward and not speaking, despite 8 and the Foundation's best attempts to wake him. "Command, we found something. The helix branches off a bit. There's a doorway there. I can see inside. It looks like a lab of some kind. We can walk to it. Hopefully it's a way out." Command sent authorization for them to proceed, and so they did. 1 reported that it appeared that they were back in the real world. The abstract shapes and colors, the infinite void was gone. They were in a Soviet research lab. There was medical equipment everywhere, syringes and jars full of, well, maybe it's best not to know what was in them. As Lambda 9 walked through the facility, checking every corner before rounding out, they felt a profound sense of unease. Surely enough, that feeling was warranted. Rounding the corner, 1 found some human remains. The man appeared to have been a researcher at one point. His brains were now stretched out and stuck to the walls like silly putty. What the hell happened here? Safely on British soil, the man who had defected from the Soviet Union sat in the interview room, chewing his bottom lip. He had spent so much time focusing on how he would escape with his life that he hadn't spared much thought for what he would say once he was on the other side. They had codenamed him Iceman, but he didn't feel particularly cold at that moment. He felt nervous, but he did his best to hide it. "I was a project manager in the Psychotronics division of the main intelligence directorate. I oversaw Project Redline, which was commissioned by Joseph Stalin following the Second World War. And before he knew what he was doing, he told his interviewer everything. Over 20 million Soviets had died during the Second World War. Their death toll eclipsed that of any other country. Iceman had witnessed it all. So when Stalin had come to him with the task of creating an ultra-powerful psychic weapon, something that could convert the entire world population to adopt Marxism-Leninism, the man had his reservations. Activating a device like that could trigger a war even deadlier than either of the 2 already experienced that century. He was part of GRU Division P, the Russian arm of highly classified experimental research. Conferring with his team, they devised a plan. They would argue they needed absolute secrecy to carry out their work, even away from the watching eyes of the KGB. Rather than create a weapon, they would create a tool for peace. Instead of promoting the values of communism, they would create a psychic tool to dampen humanity's inclination towards violence and aggression. Their method would be brutal but a necessary evil. In short, their theory was the psychic mind is often limited by the human body. A young child could have incredible psychic potential, but their physical limitations would hold them back from exercising it. Therefore, they needed to separate mind from body, and they had just the trick for that: traumatic disassociation. They would take a young, gifted psychic and tear out their mind in order to transfer that mind into the body of a controllable avatar. Iceman explained that none of them could have expected how much fate would look favorably on them. Just 2 years prior, the KGB had captured and brought in a set of triplets for them. The triplets were incredibly rare, conjoined at both the head and the torso, with 3 arms and 6 legs. It was a miracle they were still alive, so Iceman and his team set to work immediately. They dosed the triplets up with as many mind-altering chemicals as they could physically endure, before electrocuting them for prolonged periods, whilst reading anti-violent manifestos to them. It worked. the Triplets' minds disassociated, and the Soviets were able to capture it. Iceman was not forthcoming about what they did with the mind or where they transferred it. All he explained was that it worked. They took the weapon to the Norlag Gulag. 50,000 of the most vicious criminals known to man, looters, murderers, psychopaths, dropped their makeshift knives and refused to move an inch, even as we threw the gates of the camp wide open. We did that. The final test was on Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. From thousands of kilometers away, they activated Project Redline and influenced the two world leaders at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. War was averted, but Khrushchev was furious. He removed the entire team, killing a number of them, and began to weaponize Project Redline. If they could fire it at an advancing army, they'd never lose a single soldier ever again. To do this, it needed to be stronger. They were to implant the consciousness into another subject, torture them further, and disassociate again, amplifying the psychic abilities. Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 were stuck in the facility. The blizzard had been so strong that 7 and 8 had to return to base the previous night and come back. Having spent a night lost and wandering through the Helix, descending deeper and deeper, the team had noticed that the world around them was getting darker. Periodically, they could hear Force screaming and falling past them once again before dropping out of sight again beneath them. They had tried to catch him, to pull him back, but he was always just out of reach, desperate to be saved. 7 and 8 returned, and their psychic puppet radio contact was resumed with command. The team found another door. Searching through it, they were horrified to find their own corpses floating in the air in front of them, dressed up in lab coats. Just like the scientists from the levels above them, their brains were stretching out and lying together in some kind of web. Yet further down the Helix, they found another door. 1 and 3 decided to go inside, leaving the rest of the team standing on the Helix, ready to catch 4 if he fell past again. This time, 2 was in contact with command through his psychic link to the men by the chopper. He soon reported hearing 4's screams getting closer and closer. The group stood around, ready to catch him. There he is. I can see him. He's definitely falling towards us. Yeah, I see it too. Command, there's something up with 4. It looks like he's spread-eagled. His arms are stretched out. He's screaming. It's not getting louder. It's getting flatter. There would be no further contact with 2, 5, and 6. By the time 1 and 3 returned from scouting out the room, they were alone. 1 couldn't even sense the presence of any of their squad mates anymore. They had no option but to continue to descend the Helix into the darkness. The smell of burning flesh filled their noses. The echoes of death were all around them. Voices cried out in pain and fear. And then, new voices, speaking in Russian, cut over the top.
Stop it. Give in. Don't resist. Resisting is bad. You will be punished if you resist. Begin electrical discharge. 500 volts. 3 amps. Increase voltage every minute.
The operatives had no choice but to listen to the memory of the triplets being tortured. Not just the sounds, but the emotions that flood them. Those weren't someone else's memories anymore. They were becoming their own. And just as they saw into the mind of the triplets saw them in return. Command, it's trying to open me up, like it did everyone else, but I can see into it. It's learning from us. It knows all about me. The squad, the Foundation, they're almost on me. It's the Conjunction, the scientists, the monsters that made this thing, the ones it knew before it died, was that they wanted it to conjunct. It wants to make us part of it. Don't come back here. It wants to make the whole world part of it. And at that moment, the entirety of Mobile Task Force Lambda 9 dropped dead. In that same moment, a multicolored sphere of energy 5 kilometers wide appeared over the facility, dwarfing the mountains around it, designated SCP-2664-A. For years, the Foundation dropped psionically dampening materials and psionically stumped D-Class personnel into the sphere in hopes of slowing its growth. No other containment measures could be acted upon. That was until 1300 hours on the 25th of December 2000, Christmas Day. SCP-2664-A suddenly fluctuated, releasing an enormous amount of psionic energy that resulted in the brain death of all humans within a 200-kilometer radius. The following day, at 1700 hours, a global occult coalition satellite launched a spherical payload right into the heart of SCP-2664-A. For 13 minutes, tremendous amounts of radiation were detected emanating from inside the sphere, before just as suddenly as it had appeared, SCP-2664-A disappeared entirely, leaving just the payload in its place. Before the Foundation was able to recover the payload, it launched into the atmosphere and was lost. Subsequent reconnaissance operations to the site have confirmed no abnormal radioactive or psionic readings. To all intents and purposes, SCP-2664 appears to be gone. As such, the file has been marked as neutralized. Long may it stay that way. Now check out SCP-4007 Unit 731 and SCP-186 to end all wars.